how very much I've loved you, how very much I've tried my best to give you the good life. But in spite of all of that I've tried, a handful of our people, with their lies, have made our life impossible. There's no way to detach ourselves from what's happened today. Not only we're in a compound situation, not only are there those who have left and committed the betrayal of the century. Some have stolen children from others, and they're in pursuit right now to kill them because they stole their children. And we are sitting here waiting on a powder keg. I don't think this is what we want to do with our babies. I don't think that's what we had in mind to do with our babies. It was said by the greatest of prophets from time immemorial, no man takes my life from me, I lay my life down.
You are now listening to the ATI Podcast with Barrett and Josh.
Hey miss, I tried to reach you, hard to imagine you being busy. Why must this always be such a struggle?
Welcome back to the ATI Podcast, episode 11. Barrett here to get our journey started today. This week, Josh and I will be welcoming guest Ridge Jackson to the show to discuss Jim Jones, Jonestown, and the cult known as the People's Temple. Ridge is a good friend of the show. Ridge and I first crossed paths in Little Dribblers Basketball League in elementary school. Then we later reconnected in high school through many mutual friends. Later, Ridge would be in several of the bands we had in the local area, primarily playing guitar and secondarily bass. However, many of our like interests outside of our pursuit of music kept us all engaged. Things like true crime, conspiracies, cults, games, movies, etc., resulting in a nearly 25-plus year friendship and acquaintances. Therefore, none better to invite to the show to discuss Jonestown. Now, let's set the table for the discussion, Jonestown. The story of Jonestown begins with Jim Jones, a white minister who preached about unconventional socialist ideas and progressive ideals. Predominantly, he recruited African American people to his congregation, which was very unusual for the time. That congregation would become to be known as the People's Temple. At the height of its popularity in the 1970s, the People's Temple had memberships estimated in the thousands and courted many local politicians and people of influence, including Harvey Milk. But by 1977, Jim Jones had grown paranoid from media scrutiny over the People's Temple's suspicious activities. Jones and his numerous followers moved to an agricultural settlement, aka Jonestown, in Guyana, the remote country near Venezuela. In 1978, the mass suicide and deaths that took place on November 18th resulted in the largest number of U.S. casualties until September 11th of 2001. Famously and infamously, this cult is responsible for the phrase, "must be drinking the Kool-Aid." Interlaced in the show today, as heard in the show's open, we're going to be infusing excerpts from the Jonestown Death Tape that was released by the FBI in recent years. At the close of the show today, we're going to hear the conclusion of the Death Tape, as well as an awesome exclusive single debut of Riff Master's Path of Might out of St. Louis, featuring, from the Mineral area, our own Marcus Newstead. Alrighty, we're going to jump into the lovely cult known as the People's Temple, Jim Jones, and all of the fun that took place in Jonestown today. We got our good buddy Ridge here on the show with us.
Hey!
Welcome to Pound Town, Ridge. This is our temple
the palace
of pleasure.
Pound, baby.
All right.
It's nice to be here. Yeah.
We're happy to have you, sir.
Yeah. Good to see you all again.
We thought it would be very appropriate to have you on this episode in particular because I know, like, you know, some of our earliest bonding was over things like eliminating cults and outside of playing music,
occult stuff,
kind of occult type things and talk and that sort of stuff. So, anytime I've ever found out about something cult wise, like I've shared it with you, you've shared it with me, that sort of thing.
you guys are
serial
like,
killers, that sort of stuff.
Well, even like media, you guys like horror films and stuff like that. So
right,
you guys always shared that.
Yeah.
Anything to desensitize me is usually what we go for. Like Ridge and I went on this bender one time. We found like this blog about the worst movies ever made, like, most disturbing films.
Oh God.
And so we literally torrented every single one.
Yeah.
And we did movie marathons for like a few days where we tried to watch as many of them as we could. Like we went on like a 6-hour bender. Like, we watched like Trash Humpers.
Oh,
we
God.
watched 120 Days in Sodom.
Oh shit.
We watched
120
like
Days in Sodom. That's great.
that fucked up movie with Tobey Maguire and all of them when they were real young.
What was that called?
Had Jenny Lewis in it, and Leo was in it too. It was like something Diner, I want to say was the name of it. But Leo locked it up in court, and he actually sued the studio. He didn't want it released because of how bad it made all of them look.
Yeah.
It was like ridiculous. Like they all just like sat in this diner booth, and it was just them just like ribbing on the square, just out there just like cutting it up. That's literally the entire movie.
Yeah,
And
there's
garbage.
nothing more than that.
No. And so there was nothing really disturbing or unsettling about it other than the fact that it had a lot of controversy around it because of being locked up in the courts and so on and so forth. So
Right.
Was that, or did we watch Serbian film?
Serbian
with
film,
that?
yeah, close to that for sure.
Oh, that was the worst decision we ever made.
Yeah, Serbian film's pretty brutal, and it's not for the I'm not going to probably ever watch that movie again. Like,
No.
Was that
not
bad?
willingly.
Yeah.
It's pretty bad. It's essentially the premise is this retired porn star, perhaps the most famous porn star ever. He's lured back into the industry by money, but then they start like blackmailing him, and he's like doing this progressively like worse and worse film, and he's like coming home and not remembering what he did and this, that, the other thing, and it turns out that just spoiler here, he fucks his son in the ass unknowingly. Yeah, so
Holy shit.
not
that went
really
a
my
direction
cup
I
of
didn't
tea.
expect at all. So.
Yeah, it goes 0 to 60 real quick. So yeah,
It's kind of almost like getting into some MK Ultra kind of.
yeah. Well, I'll tell you a disturbing story about that movie in particular. So our friend Brandon came back home and brought one of his buddies from the military back home, and I was at work, and this is when Brandon was still a single man. He decided to hook up with a local. While I was at work, my wife, girlfriend at the time, at the apartment with that playing with the kid from the military that we didn't know.
How
Yeah.
awkward, dude.
So she had to sit through an hour of a Serbian film with a total stranger.
While he was back and getting some local.
Yeah. While Brandon was back getting some local. Brandon, fuck you. I know you're going to hear this. So, so on to the Jim Jones subject in particular, and the People's Temple and Jonestown and Guyana, paradise, if you will, the promised land. I first recall knowing about Jim Jones, like early childhood, I'd say around 10 approximately, so like Heaven's Gate happened when I was 10 or so. And I remember I was sitting in a waiting room, and my dad had an appointment in Farmington, and in the waiting room they had Time magazine. So they had Heaven's Gate on the front of Time magazine.
What was
it
that
had just
guy?
happened.
What was the guy that led Heaven's Gate?
Marshall Applewhite.
That's
Yeah.
right. Applewhite.
Applewhite.
He was
They
it.
drink the apple juice.
Yeah.
So that's always the way you remember that guy. But anywho, they even had pictures in there. So like I'm 10 and I'm looking at the FBI released photos and everything that was in Time magazine that was published at the time. And there was a lot of mentions and allusions to Jonestown explicitly in the articles.
Right.
And so that's at least as far as printed media. I feel like it was always like known in a hearsay way, like don't drink the Kool-Aid, the famous saying, of course.
Yeah, I definitely grew up hearing that a lot.
So and if you're like, well, what does that mean? And then somebody would tell you, essentially very small bullet points. But the thing about Jonestown has always been that it was, people always jump to the end. They don't tell the story leading up to the end.
Right.
What was the cause of that? And that's, it's a natural question to always ask why to things that you don't know anything about. But whenever you start, coming in at adulthood and things like that, you're not as inquisitive in some cases or as curious. So, but Jonestown specifically was one of those that I feel like I was always aware of. Do you guys recall your memories? Ridge, how about you? First hearing about Jonestown.
It fascinated me just how he could control so many people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So were you probably like in grade school, middle school, from what you recall whenever you first heard of it?
I never really heard of it back then. I guess I just never.
Just when you got
into your
older and got a
adult-
little bit more curious.
Yeah.
I'm
and
kind
that
of
sort of
similar.
stuff.
I think like more cult stuff that I heard when I was younger was like more Branch Davidians and, because of the Timothy McVeigh bombings and he was there with the protests for the Branch Davidians and all that.
Right.
And then, Heaven's Gate and, the media, like you said, a lot of people don't know the backstory on it. And that's because the media only wants to cover the glorified mass murder event.
Right,
They don't want
right.
to cover the backstory because that doesn't
No,
sell. You know what I
no.
mean?
The headline is man kills. In Jonestown, example, 900 people.
Right.
That's the headline. So whenever you're looking at that, you're going to buy that subscription, or whatever the case is. Or like Timothy McVeigh, what they focused in on a lot was the youth deaths
Right.
in the building there.
Yeah.
Which this actually outnumbers that.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't realize, again, because it took place, in another country technically, but it all started here in the United States, folks.
Right.
So, that Jonestown was kind of that cooler topic, if you will, particularly whenever it happened. Another thing I like to do with historical stuff like this, go back and talk to people that lived it.
Oh yeah, like some of the survivor interviews are like batshit crazy to me anyway. Like
Absolutely.
some of them are still manipulated and completely involved in
Right.
that whole situation, regardless if they're a part of it still or not. You know what I mean?
I'll kind of address this here too, because it seems like an opportune time. So, like, as far as the sources are concerned, I pull from several different things. We all encouraged each other to look at several different things. So there's there's a PBS documentary in Jonestown. Watch that. Several articles out there. Rolling Stone did an article. Sometimes opinion gets littered into that sort of thing.
Oh yeah, for sure,
And I want to read this. This happened on this date. Da 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 da. Let me form my own opinion.
Right.
I don't need you to do any grand illusions for me.
Right.
So I'll read things that are more literal, like Encyclopedia Britannica, things of that ilk. There's
Right.
literally a published FBI file online for you to read. I read some of that, an FBI profile biography, even has our website.
But that's a government agency, boy. You can't
Right.
trust the FBI.
Can't touch the F.
What's
and
wrong with you, Barrett? Don't you know where you come from? Get back to your roots, son. You can't
Dale
trust the
Dribble in here,
government.
man.
God.
Gotta get Dale Dribble on the case. We would have done had this motherfucker solved a long time ago.
This was a conspiracy. from the
Speaking of
beginning.
that is actually, I guess, the first exposure or figuring out what a cult was from King of the Hill.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When Luann joins that cult.
Yeah.
Oh, dude, that episode's
and,
gold.
yeah. And there's a lot of allusions to the Jonestown
Aren't they
stuff.
wearing like the white gowns or
yeah.
whatever in that?
It's like
Yeah, they
actually
do
it's
at a
more
point.
so Heaven's Gate because they do wear jumpsuits.
Yeah.
But
They're like on the buses or whatever.
when the King of the Hill started, it started about the same time though.
Yeah.
So that's
what would we say,
Judd did that.
90s, like late 90s?
Yeah, I think that's first year was like 97, so it'd be the same year as
Right of Beavis and
Heaven's
Butthead,
Gate.
right? Like, so.
It was a springboard off of Beavis and Butthead.
Right.
Like,
So you got to think Beavis and Butthead Do America was 98? I don't know.
well, that's the movie,
Yeah.
but they had a TV show in the early 90s and MTV.
Yeah.
So.
Right.
So really, it permeated, pop culture in
yeah.
the sense that, there was a lot of jokes about it. It was on the late night circuits.
Right.
There was references in movies. There was references in TV shows, as Rich said. There was a lot of sources, but again, mostly what you hear is the joking type stuff. It's not the facts. Now,
Right.
we're not going to over inundate you with the dates and that sort of stuff. Yes, we're going to give you the start. You're going to hear a little bit of the middle dates and the end dates. But what we're really going to focus on is just kind of telling the story chronologically. And we're going to try to do it as in a condensed fashion as possible. There's other forms of media out there that cover this a little bit more long form. But I'll say very confidently, I think what we have prepared here for you guys to listen to today is just as good as many of the 2-hour documentaries that you can find literally everywhere. YouTube, if you don't
Yeah.
have TV service or whatever the case is.
It's everywhere. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Like I thought I knew a lot about Jonestown and then started doing a little more digging and
Yeah.
there's still so much.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, another thing too, as far as sources, I'll allude back to that as well. So there's a couple different books that I've read excerpts out of as well. So there's Raven, and that was done almost immediately and literally from somebody that was at Jonestown, or
Right.
And Raven is actually like littered with inaccuracies. There's a more recent one.
And this is a book, right?
Novel, yeah. There's a more recent novel. I forget the name of it now. That has the benefit of history having passed and to be able to corroborate stories and go back and speak to all the survivors and that sort of stuff. So
Right.
that one is way more accurate. But allegedly, Raven from start to finish is an entertaining read. So there's a couple different sources that are pulled from. I'll even allude to a line from Raven in today's material that we have prepared.
The world, the kingdom suffereth violence, and the violence shall take it by force. If we can't live in peace, then let's die in peace. We've been so betrayed. We have been so terribly betrayed.
Let's get into Jim Jones's early childhood. One has to think a guy who eventually we know the end, if you will, or if you don't. Obviously, over 900 people died in Guyana. Jim Jones in particular. How does a guy that orchestrates such a thing, how does he start? What makes the man tick? And these are the type of questions that we like to answer. So Jim Jones, people have wondered how many times Jim Jones, again, a man who preached racial and social equality, turned to evil. Many historians and writers surmise that Jones's dark qualities, his need to control people, his deceit, and his anger toward people who betrayed him in particular, could actually be traced back to his childhood in Indiana. Jim Jones was born on May 13th of 1931 in Crete, which is near Lynn, Indiana. Lynn, Indiana is basically where his whole childhood takes place at. Right.
Yeah.
Jim was actually born to a World War I vet, had severe complications from gas consumed. That was a big thing in World War I. Returning
mustard
vets.
gases and stuff like
Yeah.
that was a big issue.
It created-
Hitler himself, I think, suffered
Exactly
a
correct.
gas attack during World War I
Yeah.
when he was a messenger or whatever. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know why I'm bringing up Hitler. That's fucking random. Talking about another
no.
mass murdering
Jim
psychopath.
Jones.
No, he's very. A lot of people endured horrific, complications in World War I from gas attacks in particular. So, what happened to his father, essentially, kind of what was reported as far as his ailments, if you will, was he had a lack of spirit. He was a man without a will. He had a lot of lung complications in particular. Couldn't move around anywhere at any aggressive or quick pace, that sort of thing. So it left him unable to work. Fortunately, he came from a very wealthy family. Again, this is Jim Jones's father. So he came from a very wealthy family who was able to actually support them. However, Jim's mother, 17 years younger actually than his father, hooked up with
Holy
him,
shit.
and had already been through 4 marriages at that point as well.
Oh, God.
So she got married to him at 25. His mother, Lynette, considered very rough around the edges at the time. She'd been through several marriages, as I mentioned previously. She smoked, she cursed, wore pants, had a salty disposition, and was constantly making excuses for her failures. And a lot of the statements I'm going to make today are going to actually allude or foretell to things. There's going to be a little bit of foreshadowing going on. So this mistakes for her failures sort of thing.
Right.
You're going to notice as a theme today.
Right. And when we say wear pants, and we were talking at the time, you know what I mean? Like,
Exactly
it
right.
wasn't common for a woman to wear blue jeans every day
Right.
in those times. So
Yeah,
you
so
gotta
it's
think,
1931.
Right.
when
You
he's born.
got to think of.
And she was already wearing pants. So
Right,
this is about the
right.
time of the flapper boom and all that stuff too. Just happened literally a few years before that.
Right.
So she's a very unusual lady for her time. Jim's mother was forced to work in this arrangement by Jim's grandparents, essentially. That's on his father's side of the family, because she was able-bodied, much younger. Yeah, his father's family didn't really approve of his mother to begin with as it was, so it kind of set things off on the wrong track as far as that was concerned. So Jim's mother, again, Lynetta, she was a little salty about that situation
Right.
in and of itself as well. So she did constantly profess too that Jim essentially was her purpose on earth, in the sense that he was going to be a great man to do great things, and he was going to be very powerful and successful and lord over people, and just a lot of fantasy prophesying, if you will. And again, this is another thing you're going to notice, making a lot of grandiose ideas for her son to have to essentially live up to.
Right.
So one could consider that be a part. And another thing to consider here too, at the time, mental illness is not really a thing.
Right.
Like people don't
Not like it
believe
is
in
today,
it. It's
right.
not. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the mental illness boom was more so started to develop and build like in the late 70s, even into the 80s. So that the talk of mental illness, how to treat it, the different afflictions that people can have from mental illness, is quite different. There's no question that she suffered from narcissism. And, and I wouldn't say that that's ever been commonly reported as a hereditary thing to move down from generation to generation.
Right.
But it's certainly, it's infectious in the way that if you're constantly, raised by a narcissist.
Right.
And in this case, you're already sowing those seeds for the next generation to be so as well.
And you have a child mind, you're an adolescent, you know
Right.
what I mean? And you're absorbing what you see. And if his father was absent and he had a narcissistic mother and that was her way of showing affection, was filling his mind with fantasies and all this, I mean, you can see the impacts, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And in a way, again, as we'll tell, there's many decisions that he makes in his life to try and, take those stepping stones, take that path, if you will, to make those dreams a reality. Jim was actually known as a loner most of his youth. Jim would entertain his playmates often in the loft of his family's barn. Very captive audiences in his family's barn. And he would even lock up some of his friends inside the barn from time to time. Many activities took place in the barn. He would, bring dead animals into the barn, show them off to people. He would actually conduct mock funerals for the dead animals. He would experiment on dead animals.
Yeah.
Famously in the 2006 documentary Jonestown, The Life and Death of People's Temple, Jim and his childhood friends spoke about some of his odd characteristics and acts. He was obsessed with religion. He was obsessed with death. A friend of mine told me that he saw Jimmy kill a cat with a knife. And that was a direct quote from the documentary. Also, it's been said that Jones had an early fascination with Adolf Hitler. So you mentioned that Hitler talk
there you
earlier.
go.
So here we go.
Mm-hmm.
And
This
he
is where
was,
it happens.
and really the thing that he was fascinated with Hitler was the fact that he committed suicide. Outside of the charisma and the way he held the audience captive in particular, those were technically his initial fascinations with Hitler. But when it came to Hitler's suicide in April of 1945, so you have to think this actually happened in Jim's lifetime. He was 14 years old when Hitler
Big news,
approximately
too, right.
did what he did. Jim thought it was actually admirable, and he was very impressed by the fact that Hitler actually committed suicide to avoid humiliation at his captors.
Right.
So again, that tells you kind of perhaps why some of the decisions were made here that we're talking about today. Jim would also take his schoolmates to a nearby casket factory and give them tours. He'd make them lay down inside so they could experience what it was like to be dead. So what was obviously, if anybody has any sense and you're taking kids to a casket factory and putting them inside of caskets,
Right.
Probably, initially there's a herd of people out of, morbid curiosity, we'll put it that way, that want to experience this. But his numbers started to fall drastically of the kids that actually wanted to go to the casket factory with him. So,
Well, and you got to think of the times. This
Right.
is a much different time than it is
the,
today.
the
Right.
casket, the reason that they were able to do it is they left the fucker unlocked.
Oh my
They
God.
literally left a factory unlocked.
Hey, boys,
in
let's
the
go
middle
drink
of
some
town.
beers and hop in some caskets tonight.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, it sounds like kind of a good stag time.
Yeah.
With the
yeah, I would
boys.
love that.
Yeah.
That would be fantastic. But that scared the piss out of me at 10 years old. you
right.
know?
Be like a 10-year-old, be like, get in this casket, man. This is awesome. What the
But
fuck?
with them folks falling off, the young folks that is falling off of his interest for him, Jim started to target friendships and camaraderies with kids that were much younger than him, which will kind of be telling in and of again some of his decisions that he made to find people that would follow him and be a little bit more susceptible mentally that he could control and target and go after. Again, laying the foundation for later what's going down in Jonestown specifically. Jim also became very fascinated with religion at a young age, so he began attending church. He also began wearing his Sunday best at school, which also obviously caused him to stand out even more so at school and make him even more of an oddity.
Right. Yeah,
So-
I mean, you're wearing your preacher attire to school every day,
Yeah, absolutely. And really, he gets his start in the Methodist faith, and it's not on account of his own parents. Somebody locally took an interest in him. I want to say an aunt, perhaps. I don't recall exactly who, but he has somebody in his life that brings him to church.
Right.
Close
Yeah,
to his
it
family
was his
circle.
aunt.
I think it was his aunt. Yeah. So he starts going to church, and he's really interested by essentially the ceremony of it. A guy gets up, he talks, everybody's energized by it, yada, yada. Now, Methodist churches, comparatively to my experiences, are very tame.
Mild.
Because I went to an apostolic church.
Right.
And we'll do an episode on apostolic religion at some point as well.
I've got some funny stories for that episode.
So we're gonna have that's gonna continue in our cult series. This is episode 1 in our cult series, and the apostolic faith will be in there later. But
That's
then
not a cult. That's a religion.
Right. There you go.
And you know what?
That's the line.
Like, that's what's so fascinating about like even this specific story for me is because like even us three, we've grown up in the Bible Belt, and we can see the cult like following that can come with religion and how people's behaviors are when it comes to religion.
Sure.
Because we've been exposed to it.
Well, whenever
so-
you literally are inbred from inception of your life to believe that you're born in iniquity, that nothing that you can do is going to stop you from being a sinner. The minute that you come out of your mom's veg or C-section or however it goes down, you are a sinner.
Right.
And you deserve
and
to go
it's
to hell.
instilled in you from, so you got to think how this affects people later on in
Absolutely.
life. You know what I mean? Like,
So with his fascinations with church, you can also see a lot of parallels with the Hitler stuff. Again, he was interested in the guy captivating an audience, everybody bending to their need, will, regardless of what the vehicle was, religion, political beliefs. Those were just vehicles for, a
there's an
pastor or
ulterior
Hitler,
motive
if you
for
will.
sure. Right.
But yes, there's always an agenda to execute. And again, as you see things develop out with People's Temple, Jim Jones, later Jonestown, those motivations or the seeds are there in early childhood as we're painting the picture here. Also, Jim got to be known for making these impromptu speeches at pep rallies as well. So it would actually make him stand out even more so. But people were actually kind of into it because it was like very pro-school spirit. And things of that ilk.
Right.
So that also led to, coincidentally, a similar amount of time, Jim's actually organized a basketball league for like kids, and he was a kid. Yeah, so he organized his own fucking like little dribblers. Yeah,
He wasn't even very intense about it.
he was very intense, but the thing you're gonna find about Jim is he actually did have like possess good qualities. Like more than one thing can be true, right?
Right.
And this is gonna be a big theme on our show as well. Not just this show, but future episodes, especially things of this subject matter. Like you can be more than one thing. Like you can be intelligent and you can be purely evil.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So we could go back to Hitler on that talk, and as you heard in our censorship, the classic episode that we dropped, we talk about Hitler and we talk about yes, he's intelligent, but it doesn't change the fact that he was capable of doing horrific things.
Right.
You're going to see the same traits with Jim Jones. He was very highly organized. He had a lot of administrative skills in particular. This started to shine whenever he created this basketball league. He created this basketball league, and everybody wanted to play in it. It was high in demand, and then he fucks it up at some point, and there's some story to the effect of he like made a trap door, and somebody fell through it and got like really injured, and it freaked everybody out, so like nobody wanted to do the fucking basketball league anymore.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, wasn't he like, he was telling kids to just, hey kid, here's a trap door.
Yeah.
Go down there.
Yeah, go fuck with that.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. So like, even as he starts to have things going good for him, he fucks it up.
Right.
He gets in his own way with his like fucked up, fascination for doing things to people with death, so on and so forth. Jim's father, close to all of this, died, unfortunately. So that kind of propelled Jim into religion and helping support the family. So Jim would actually, jump from church to church too, and really take a study, do a case study on preachers, how they talked,
How they're captivating their congregation.
their amnic pentameter, the way that they speak and so on and so forth, and really just start taking notes. He like literally, and this is a kid taking notes.
Yeah.
Okay. Kind of his patterns, what he does, and how and his upbringing gets totally interrupted by his dad dying. His dad dies, and his mom. So the family doesn't give a shit about the mom or whatever, and basically she takes off. Yeah, they got cut off from the family.
Right.
So she ends up moving, and what's fucked up about it, it's like as if the dad never lived. Like they have no acknowledgement, like they don't revisit the grave. The mom just moves on with her life. Jim Jones moves on with her life. as if it never happened, which is highly unusual in many respects.
Yeah.
And see, it's even been said that whenever he had his grave laid, they left a spot for his wife to be buried next to him. And it never happened. But somebody came back later and etched in her details on his tombstone.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's pretty wild as well.
That is wild. She's not there, right?
They move, and this forces Jim to work and help support the family. So Jim is with his mom, and he takes up a job at a residential care facility. And Jim fucking takes off there. Like, he does fantastic. He is really great with the old people. He's really great. Like, he's been known to, like, some of the comments that were made about him was he's great at sponge baths. He makes sponge baths fun.
Oh my God.
Jim Jones just smiling ear to ear. Just
Yeah, just greasing up.
Don't forget that crevice, Jimmy.
Sudsy McQueen.
Slap that sponge down in there the right way, boy.
So Jim, in between shoving his fist up in an old lady's ass and jerking off the elderly men. So, you know, what do you end up actually knowing about Jim Jones? I make that joke, but, you know, like, it might have actually happened.
He might,
This might be where
have been doing some fucked up
That's why
shit.
he got, like, 5-star reviews on Yelp for his handle of the elderly. It makes all the sense in the world now. That's the first time I come in 20 years, Sonny.
It got me harder than a rock. I didn't even have to take that Viagra.
So Jim takes off at the hospital. He essentially just knew he could never be a doctor. So he was like, I'm going to be the fucker in charge of the doctor, which he immediately identified was the administrator. Mm-hmm. And so he like set his sights on that. So he put his all into it, and he did great, like I said. In particular, another comment that was made about him and the great work that he did was that he was like fantastic with grieving families. Like, somebody died in the residential care facility, and he was like, again, 5-star reviews on Yelp. I make that joke, but you know, the families were just like highly complimentary of this. So one of the patient care techs there, or nurses, was Madeline Baldwin. And so she started to take notice of Jim. And so Madeline was drawn to him on account of this, and just kind of his general disposition, the fact that he was religious, she was religious. They had very similar political interests, so they just hit it off immediately. The bad thing about that is, well, not so bad, is that Madeline's family actually was had a huge political influence. They were civil workers. They were known, very noteworthy in the community as civil servants in particular. So, but they also did not approve of Jim. They thought he was weird. And again, you know, common.
Right.
I don't know why.
Yeah, not at all.
Yeah, so far, I mean, I just don't understand why people think he's a weird guy. You know, he's getting in the crevices and taking care of people.
Sometimes like to sew random animal limbs onto a cat.
Yeah.
You know, put kids in a trapdoor.
Put kids in a trapdoor.
My kind of guy.
I can't understand the reputation of it. Yeah. Why?
Yeah.
So actually, her family as well was like pretty close knit in the Methodist Church as well. So Jim tried to work his way up through the Methodist Church. Much of what I read, at least, was the short of it is like things weren't materializing quickly enough for him. Even though he did at first start a church with the Methodist Church, but he wasn't getting the numbers that he wanted.
Right. His ambitions were
and he
way
was
higher
than politically stifled by the Methodist Church, because it's basically like hey guys, here's some news. Religion's like franchising a fucking restaurant. And it is. And anybody tells you differently is wrong.
Right.
And if that incites you, then you're just ignorant.
Right.
When it comes to some of these
business model to a church, right?
Especially these major denominations.
Right.
Let's talk about the Catholic Church.
Right.
Let's talk about Methodists. Let's talk about Protestants.
Let's talk about the TV Angelicus or whatever.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about Joel Osteen. Let's talk about, you know what I mean?
So there's a lot of politics that go into, you know, having a church, being approved to have your own church. Essentially, there's boards to a lot of these. Different denominations.
Right.
So, like, for example, like my family's pretty deep in with UPC, apostolic, that sort of stuff. There's literally a UPC board. Like, they didn't even start recently, like, allowing women preachers. And, it's crazy. It was not like I mean, women could preach occasionally, but like it was very uncommon for a woman to be a preacher, to have her certificate to be approved by the board.
And run a church.
Right.
Yeah.
And then that was the next hurdle. It'd be one thing if you're traveling evangelical, but, you know, to actually be head of a church. And so those similar politics permeates all these major denominations.
Right.
And it's kind of trickled down over the years as some of these denominations have broken off and started their own practices and so on and so forth. What Jim decided to do was essentially the fucking Elvis Presley, go around and steal shit from black people. So, you know, Jim started traveling to revivals, a lot of evangelical events. And again, what I mentioned earlier, this was kind of the boom of the apostolic church and those teachings. And so he adopted many of their beliefs and practices, and more so robbing of kind of the ceremony, the presentation, the charisma of the pastors, the acts that they would employ, like, you know, speaking in tongues, boisterous responses, kind of call and respond stuff where you're amened very loud and vocally, you know, involuntarily, and so on and so forth. So Jim really liked that, the idolation of the pastors in the church, how they were almost, not his words, but I'll use them, like rock stars, by example, you know. So they drew attention, they commanded a crowd. And again, Jim was just so fascinated with anybody like that.
Right.
All right, we all know the struggle. You ask your friend to watch a movie, they won't watch it. For whatever reason, it's ridiculous, it's an amazing movie, they're going to love it, but they just won't watch it. My name's Daniel King. I host a podcast called It's Just Two Movies. Every week we try to pick one good movie and then another movie that's got something in common with it that's so bad it's good. Sometimes we hit the mark, sometimes the bad movie is just bad. But we'll sort through them all for you, and we'll have some drinks and laughs along the way. We also pepper in a little improv comedy just because we have fun doing it. Also, no shortage of dick and fart jokes here, so if that's not your crowd, maybe it wasn't meant to be. Come check us out anywhere podcasts are found: Spotify, Apple Music, Rhapsody, iTunes, you know the places. Or check us out on social networks at It's Just Two Movies. All right, cheers.
A big major thing that also kind of got Jim and his wife together, and a lot of his teachings, was that everybody was created equal. And that doesn't seem controversial to most of us, or at least anybody with any damn sense today. But back then, well, it's controversial. We're talking about pre-1964 civil rights movement. We are talking still segregated, regardless if you're in the South or the North. And Indiana in particular, where Jim was from, was actually the KKK headquarters was located there at the time. So a lot of people would think it'd be in the South,
right? Or
like, you know, someplace like Alabama or whatever the case is, or Mississippi. Right. Not the case. You know, Indiana was actually a hotbed for KKK activity and their political affiliation. So it was, you know, people were still segregating places, and Jim was entirely against that. And so that was what kind of helped draw his wife to him too, and was a part of their just straight up platform. Jim also found that his wife had like socialist beliefs. Again, very controversial at the time to be a socialist. Right. Obviously, coming off the heels of
stuff like that.
Yeah, you're coming off the heels of, well, communism employs themes of socialism, but there's literally a socialist political movement separate of communism as well.
But what I'm saying, during that time, anybody that held the socialist ideology was considered a communist. That was a common label.
Hey, it still happens today.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've been called a communist several times.
Bernie Sanders was called a communist, you know, so on and so forth. Right. So, not the case, folks, in case you didn't know. But
we'll get into that another day.
We'll pump the brakes on that one. But anywho, so they had believed in the socialist construct politically. So they were movers and shakers in the world of religion. They were movers and shakers in the world of politics. Jim, it has to be mentioned as well, hooked up very closely to whenever he founded the People's Temple, what would be known as essentially as cult church, so on and so forth, which will take up the rest and most of the discussion, is that he ended up bumping into a very big inspiration for him, which was Father Divine. Around 1955, whenever Jim Jones did officially establish People's Temple in Indianapolis, Indiana, he took a lot of his structure from Father Divine in particular. So Father Divine, just to give you a little backstory on him, he was very popular, controversial black evangelicalist at the time. He was the founder of the Peace Mission movement, so that was kind of his version of his People's Temple, if you will.
It's cold.
Right. Born sometime in the 1880s, Father Divine actually started a religious movement in the 1910s that drew huge numbers of worshipers who saw him actually as God. So he kind of started that talk, and this is very similar to apostolic beliefs, that God's inside of you. That's the Holy Spirit taking
the
you
Holy
over.
Ghost or whatever. Yeah.
So this is an oversimplification. I think that's kind of really what he was doing, and it was, transcribed at the time as this.
Right.
They're kind of two separate things. Is either saying you're literally God or that God's inside of you, from the religious, I guess, argumentative standpoint.
Deeper God.
So he was kind of at the start of that, and he, in Raven in particular that we mentioned earlier, the book, it was said that a judge suddenly died shortly after handing down this preacher to prison and sentenced as a public nuisance in particular. Not only did Father Divine do kind of these wacky things at the time, he had kind of a mob mentality in the back scenes, and it's also believed that he killed people or had people killed. Yeah. So yeah,
there was almost a criminal element to his
absolutely
cult following. Like, I mean, obviously, mass murder and mass suicide is
right.
But you know what I'm saying,
right?
Like,
I don't know a lot about Father Divine. I want to dig a little bit deeper. I think after this,
that'd be cool.
That. But didn't he actually convince everyone that he was God? Or that's how he went?
Well, that's definitely where Jones went eventually. But he got that idea from Father Divine. Yeah, the other wild-ass thing that took place with Father Divine is that his wife died. He's an older man. His wife was an older woman. She dies, and he turns around and gets a 21-year-old Canadian bride. White, mind you.
White bride.
And his excuse is that his wife's spirit jumped into that body. So this is actually going to lay the groundwork for something that happens eventually here.
I don't get it, man. I don't understand how a follower doesn't hear this and go, "What the fuck?"
It's different times, and
right.
That's kind of a part of the cult mentality, the hive mentality too. It's like we'll just say bred into this eventually. It's like it doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
You're 7 years deep in a church, and then they say one wild thing. It's like, oh, we never had a problem in 7 years, and they said this one thing. Oh, I'll overlook it this time.
Right.
It's kind of like that, and then that inch that you give somebody becomes a mile mentally, or 3 miles, if you will.
Yeah.
So that's, again, getting back to
they're
Jim
batshit
Jones.
crazy, but they run the church, so whatever. Let them be batshit crazy.
Absolutely. And kind of the very revealing thing I want to mention too, I meant to mention this earlier whenever I talked about first knowing of Jamestown. It was never framed to me, at least anybody that ever told me about Jonestown, that this actually was rooted in Christianity.
Right.
Like it's a cult. Yes, it's true, but again, two things can be true at the same time.
Right.
This was rooted in Christianity.
Right.
So people don't want you to know that that's the case, because
they want to separate that from that.
You get the shit stank on you, right?
Right.
Kind of that phenomenon.
Right.
So anytime it was ever framed, especially in the media back then, and we can get into a discussion about media as well, but people, even liberal media outlets, would kind of tail that back, right? They wouldn't get into those controversial attacks on Christianity in most respects. So. But back to Father Divine and his wife jumping spirits. So Father Divine laid the groundwork for some inspirations that later we'll see in Jones and his own relationships. Another interesting thing is that Jones actually employed his wife to attend many community meetings, such as town halls and political rallies and things of that ilk, essentially employing her as a spy. And she would just kind of go in and take detailed notes as far as who the prominent people were in the city or in those meetings or those organizations, so that Jim could follow up the next week or the week after and come into these meetings and basically just hold court and take over the meetings and talk to all the actual decision makers and get things done and not even waste his time on the fucking piss ants.
Again, the intelligence.
Yeah.
I mean,
master manipulation.
Right.
And this is a young Jim Jones doing this. So we're probably talking, he's born in 31, 55. So we're talking like a 25-year-old Jim Jones approximately, maybe a little bit older, that's actually making these decisions, being this, I guess, conniving in some respects, But well after Jim opened his own church, actually, it's important for us to mention that Jim actually made it a point to actually have his churches in the inner city area as well, and that kind of helped combat some of the racial type stuff, again, to desegregate the churches. And he would really like start to eavesdrop on people as services started, to listen to their conversations, to see what they talked about, but like out of their notice of him. So like, let's say you and Ridge are having a conversation across the room, and I just happen to stand in the corner and pretend like I'm talking to somebody else, but I just listen to what your guys are talking about, right?
Right.
And you happen to tell Ridge, well, lately my eyesight's been getting so bad I can't see anymore. This exact same thing happened inside of his church,
Right.
where he went up to the pulpit after the fact, he being Jim Jones, and would say, I hear there's a Sally in the crowd tonight, and you're starting to lose your vision. And she'd look around and, oh my God, come to the front. And you're already wowed that much, you're going to get caught up in the spirit of it.
Right.
Take your glasses off, Sally. You can see so much better. And like, and then Jones would have plants throughout the crowd, and we'll get to this as well too, to kind of aid along the behaviors. So like maybe like his secretary, for example, would go in and walk up to people and say things.
Right.
So like this would progress into like, this seems relatively innocent to start, but then this starts progressing into some like weird shit. Like people that have cancer come to, and
talk about vulnerability of people.
Absolutely.
Right. You know what I mean? Like,
so people that, and this is like people first understanding cancer and that sort of stuff too. And again, you have to consider the times. They're coming to the church probably because they have nowhere else to turn. Let's start there. So they're looking to believe in something, to give them some hope. So what would happen is they call him up to the front with the cancer, and like one of his secretaries would come up next to them, like dressed as a nurse, and have like chicken livers in their hands and like shove it in their mouths. So they would spit it out. And then they would say that was them extracting the cancer from their body.
God, dude.
And so everybody saw the visitable, even if it wasn't true, and the person would want to rebut it. Not to say that this actually happened, but I'm just saying, let's talk about it from a psychological practicality standpoint. Like, you couldn't, like, everybody already saw it. The word caught fire. The whole place is freaking out. Moods are elevated. People are like, oh my God, he's healing people.
Right.
So on and so forth. So like, everybody's getting caught up in the spirit of the event and stuff. And it's not like, again, we're talking about a time that not everybody has cell phones and shit. Like, everything's literally word of mouth. You might not even have your own phone in your home.
Right.
As crazy as that sounds, this is like relatively
you had to call
before
the operator
TVs.
to get 911, that kind of situation.
Absolutely. So all of these seeds he's starting to sow are really starting to affect his influence over people, obviously. And another interesting fact to consider as well, kind of to get back into lean back into the desegregation stuff and into socialism as well, is that Jim and Marceline actually were the very first couple in Indiana's history to adopt a black kid.
That's wild. I didn't know that.
1961. Yeah.
That's crazy.
Jim Jones Jr. is who they adopted in 1961. And then they would later go on to actually adopt a Native American child as well as a Korean child, too. So they had 5 kids in all, 3 minorities. One of the 2 left over, we'll say, is a biological son, Stephen. And then they had an older daughter. It was actually the first person that they adopted, a white girl. So that's like, he has 5 kids in his home. But also what Jim Jones starts to do, I detail that to let you know this, he starts moving in old people into his house because he's convincing those old people in his church to sell their homes, give all their assets to the church, and he'll take care of them.
Right.
Which he does.
Right.
He does. But the house becomes too small. Then they have to start opening their own institutions. So like Jim was actually like running a fucking racket. Like eventually it developed out into old folks' homes. He had orphanages. He had soup kitchens. They had a laundromat eventually. Like I think they even had a car wash at some point. Just like it's crazy. Like the enterprises that they ended up getting into.
He's making that money.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like if he didn't have that evil inside of his head, like he could have been a very successful person.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
And I think that there really was, I think he had, well, no, it's not even thinking, it's a fact. He had political aspirations. Like he ran for mayor. It was said that he wanted to run for governor as well. He had political, and the two things went hand in hand, very much like a Hitler, in the sense that like he had these certain ideologies outside of the realm of politics, got infused into politics, if you will.
Right.
Became their national platform. Like Jim Jones was like literally trying to be Hitler again. There's without question exactly what he was trying to orchestrate.
Right.
When you know all the details. And that's something that escaped my childhood as well. Like, I didn't really know that at the time. And it was really telling, in this research, you heard he was fascinated with Hitler, and you just assume that, you hear that about a lot of crazy people,
Right.
over history. Back into kind of the diversity of People's Temple, one could suspect that the groundwork that we've laid so far, that the People's Temple is often branded as a cult, but again, we're trying to detail like how this started off innocently and just as any other church in many respects. The people there, they blindly devoted their allegiances to the man and the cause, and often at the expense of their own selves. It wasn't uncommon for people in the church to work like 22-hour days, 23-hour days. And it really became, once you subscribe to socialism in many respects, things start to become about what you do in the machine. And that's what your worth is, not how much money you have, not anything of that.
It's your
ilk.
impact on...
It's the work that you do.
Right.
So this became like a thing of one-upsmanship. It kind of started out with 8-hour days, and then I went to 10, and then 12, and then 13,
I've
16.
been here 6 days, motherfucker.
Yeah,
what now?
That's exactly what would happen.
Right.
Where they would go on these day stretches then too of so many hours a day. So it kind of became a braggadocious thing inside the church, outside of just the symbolism and your status inside the church as well. The church was also obviously known for its very progressive and idealist activism. So, desegregation, we talked about that. So what Jim would actually do is he would actually go around intimidating, negotiating, campaigning, just anything to local businesses. And the idea there was to desegregate the business, to accept members of his community. And a lot of what Jim targeted too, we talked about moving in the inner city, was poor black people in his church. Like, he would allow poor black people to come to his church.
Right. And during the time, again, speaking
no
of the
other
time,
church was.
right.
Let's make that clear.
Segregation and everything else, right.
Like, especially in his town, like, he was of the first to do it. He was doing this, and then he would turn around and try and make these arrangements with businesses. Okay, well, you're going to serve our kind here, and we're going to sell the place out. And so, he would, literally go in, do a sit-in. He'd be, the only white person, or him and his wife, or him and some of his family members would go in and do a sit-in in a restaurant and bring all black people there. The church would pay for everybody's meals. It's a win-win for everybody. The business gets the business, and you're using the church funds that you literally said that you would use to take care of everybody, right?
Right. Everybody's getting a meal.
Right. Everybody's getting a meal, so on and so forth. And that's literally, again, you can see these early machinations of, good things happening. And another thing that he would do that was really intelligent, that's going to reveal how smart this motherfucker actually was, he would take people into restaurants on off hours, 3 p.m. So kind of a big restaurant, you get your lunch rush and your dinner's rush. There's always a lull right there in the middle, and that's about the 3 p.m. mark.
Right.
And he would literally take his whole congregation in at 3 p.m., sell the business out on every day
on a low
when he was
time.
pushing one.
On a low time.
So they would maximize the business's profits, because even if they were still dealing with lingering racism where white people didn't want to eat with black people, they could come during the prime hours, and it didn't affect their schedule.
It didn't affect business.
But the People's Temple members abided to Jim Jones's schedule,
right,
mind you. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't people of a working class that went to the church. There were people that had jobs outside the church, especially in its early goings. People outside the church were essentially at first expected to donate 10% of their tithes. Then that jumped to 20 or 25%. Then that jumped to 50. And I believe it jumped to 70, and then ultimately ended up at 90%.
90% of your income's got to go to the church.
Especially if he was housing you and you worked. So if he's providing housing. This, again, kind of created a reliance of people on Jim Jones specifically, further removing them from society. And there would be...
Sounds like crazies, recruiting crazies, the more and more we dig into.
Right, absolutely. Another thing Jim was kind of doing at the time, and it was being well known in the community for, and how he would actually recruit a lot of church members, he was a fucking door-to-door pet monkey salesman. He actually went around and sold pet monkeys to fucking people. And there's a hilarious story in the PBS documentary in particular, where there's an elderly woman that tells how she became a member of the People's Temple Church. And she actually details what got her to come to church is because her mother's pet monkey hanged itself.
God. Whoa,
inside,
no way.
in the
leash?
house. And that's the whole reason that she wanted to buy another monkey, so that in turn made the daughter go to church and become a member.
The monkey even knew some shit was up, dude. And
Yeah.
He was like, "Fuck it, I'm out, dude. I can't."
He knew that
this.
those evil storm clouds were rolling in, and he's like, fucking hung himself.
I don't want nothing to do with this.
He really liked monkeys because their swords. Well,
Yeah, we're going to get to it, but there's a very interesting mascot for the temple as well. Jim Jones is just like a very extravagant character in many respects as well. Now, you got to keep in mind, too, a lot of people see Jim Jones and the iconic images are like the red suits or Dickie's tuxedo type look, and he's got sunglasses on. Like this is pre-sunglasses Jim Jones,
like
too.
the aviator pilot type glass, gold frame glasses.
those sideburns.
Absolutely. And those epic sideburns and that epic side comb. But Jim Jones, he started manipulating people too in his church, along with his showmanship I mentioned earlier with the healings.
We had some value, but now we don't have any value.
Well, I don't see it like that. I mean, I feel like that as long as there's life, there's hope. That's my faith.
Well, everybody dies. Someplace that hope runs out because everybody dies. I haven't seen anybody yet that didn't die. And I like to choose my own kind of death for a change. I'm tired of being tormented to hell. That's what I'm tired of. Tired of it. 1,200 people's lives in my hands, and I certainly don't want your life in my hand. But I'm going to tell you, Christine, without me, life has no meaning. I'm the best friend you'll ever have.
I'll get back, people working. So like if Jim Jones found out, and this is where kind of some of the dark seeds start to sow in, is if he found out somebody in the church that was an active member, if you will. Now, we're not talking about casual visitors, that sort of stuff. He was very good about compartmentalizing many atrocities inside of the church, like to his inner circle, people that had been there for the longest time. And we'll get into like some of those more specifically. But if somebody in the church, for example, went out and saw a movie, or they dated somebody that they weren't allowed to date in the church, like all dating folks had to be approved and that sort of thing. Or let's say they bought a new shirt. Originally it started with like fines and lighthearted stuff, but then it turned into like public humiliation. So like they would have a meeting at church and they'd bring somebody up and they would like dress them down in front of everybody, like verbally.
Never got to the point of lashings or anything.
We're getting there, buddy. We're getting there. And we've got many good stories there. It kind of started there. And most of it always ended with like people hugging each other and saying I love you and that sort of stuff. So it was kind of healing in many ways, although confrontational and not necessarily ideal. And that's kind of how it started. Jim started to get a little bit more liberal with some of his teachings and some of his beliefs. So one thing, initially, and it was very common at the time, we're in the middle of Cold War, World War II, fallout, if you will, Korean War, so on and so forth. It was all about this time. Jim Jones starts to be very anti-Russia initially.
Right.
He's very anti-Russia. Everybody in the United States is anti-Russia.
Especially now. I mean.
Yeah. Well, and at this time in particular as well.
Right.
This is heavy USSR.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So I want to mention that now because we're also gonna later on kind of address some of the Russia stuff. And we mentioned in the open of the show too that we were going to be infusing clips from the death tapes. I want to mention this now too. You can listen to the death tapes. There's a FBI. I mentioned earlier. You can get on the FBI. You can listen to it from start to finish. Ours is not in its entirety. It's 50 minutes long. It's just little clips we're going to be dropping in here and there. So keep your ears peeled. But I want to allude to on the death tapes in particular, there is a mention of Russia and them escaping to Russia, which we'll address kind of chronologically. But you're going to see how Jim's feelings about Russia change. But it's also important to kind of realize where you are in the timeline and events in history that we're about to lay out here too. More crazy things started happening in the church beyond that. We already mentioned earlier that he talked old people into selling their homes, but then this like went beyond old people. Again, the working class people and that sort of stuff. So that created, a need for housing beyond. A lot of other shit that started happening too is that he was offered $5,000 to sleep with a woman. And so like publicly, and Jim went ahead and took advantage of that and said he was doing it for the church. So,
well, why not? I'd do it for the church. $5,000.
I'd do it for the $5,000, brother.
Yeah.
You don't got to mix church into this. I'll just take the $5,000.
Man.
And another thing too, he started to stage fake assassination attempts. So like his first fake assassination attempt, I believe, was like right outside of his house, and he had, you've seen some of these older houses where they have like the columns on the front porch for like the overhang, or if you will, and typically there's like a second level balcony perhaps that like it protrudes out. He stepped out on his porch and shot back at his house with a gun and got a bullet lodged in there, laid on the ground and acted like somebody shot at him until people came up to him.
Oh my God. Shot at Jim.
And, he was unfazed because, and then this is where it starts.
Do you still have the gun in his hand?
No, not when he was found.
backwards.
No. This is where he starts to like give people the impression that he's God. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And he starts to infuse in his messages. So he starts like cursing in his messages, which is like people find very unusual for the times and everything.
Right.
But, everybody's behind it. He's not getting any resistance on that sort of thing. And even like, he would even in some of his sermons be like, say fuck. And everybody like, fuck. And then he's like, say fuck again.
Fuck yeah, baby.
Like there's actually tapings of some of his sermons. Like you can hear like he's like cursing left and right.
Right.
But he was very much a chameleon, a social chameleon, in the sense that he would reposition his conversation and what he would say depending on what crowd he was in front of at the time. So
he was adaptive.
He would, like, for example, again, socialism's a touchy subject in the public at this time. If he was out to recruiting people, he might give a message about God, especially if he was like in a rural area.
Right.
His message would be strictly about God, not mention anything about his socialist beliefs. On the flip side, if he was like to a more densely populated city, like near a university, something like that, wasn't uncommon for him to infuse a little bit of that socialism talk, and that would get over a little bit more so. Right. He had to start to learn that over the time. So this started to fine tune his ability to like read people, read crowds, so on and so forth. So this kind of gets into that maniacal nature of him a little bit more so, and his ability to manipulate people. Jones, too, I mentioned, took the money from the lady. I don't know if I explicitly mentioned this, but he said he was investing that back into an orphanage.
Yeah.
An orphanage, right? Yeah.
I believe so.
Yeah. So like he tried to like say exactly where the money went. Now,
to have a paper trail.
You got to think that let's talk on this too. He's having people sell their homes, and elderly in particular. So it's not uncommon for an older person to be in a home for a long time, maybe procured a little bit of property, particularly if there are earlier settlers at this time. We're talking turn of the century, mid-century.
Right.
So these are probably, for the time, relatively decent chunk of change houses, So you're talking like maybe in today's market by inflation, a house that's like $130,000 to $160,000. So the church gets let's say the church gets that per person that they're taking care of. So the bank account starts stacking up.
Yeah.
So he starts getting a little bit of power behind him financially as well to do things. As a part of that, Jim Jones, too, eventually invests in getting like greyhounds that are sold on the cheap, so he can actually travel with his people and go to events and stage events, especially as they move into the more compound phases of the church. So Jim builds up his church. I think it's like almost like 700 people at this time. He's getting a lot of notoriety, like I mentioned earlier. People are starting recognizing from the fake assassination attempts, his public healings, all the good that he's doing in the community, desegregating people, so on and so forth. So he's kind of living large at this time. So Jim gets, and we know that Jim's obsessed with death already, he gets a subscription to Esquire. And coincidentally, it's not a subscription it's the same Esquire that we read today.
Yeah.
That very commonly has celebrities on the cover now. The Esquire at this time did an article on safest places from nuclear holocaust, essentially, because there's a lot of nuclear threat with the Cold War, obviously.
Right.
And being fresh off the heels of dropping bombs off of, just 10 years prior plus, in Japan.
Right.
Jim gets really fascinated with this. So actually what's often missed in the Jim Jones story is before he moves out to California and makes this huge compound, Jim Jones actually goes to Brazil for 2 years and is on the lam essentially with his family, which coincidentally is another place that was supposed to have from nuclear refuge. So he's fucking off with his family down there. Like literally, too.
Right.
One thing I failed to mention too, the more nefarious things, and this is a big detail, so pardon me for not mentioning this earlier. Jim starts fucking all kinds of women in his church, too. Like,
God.
And then for God.
Right.
And
that's a common theme. with
and
cults,
fucking
too.
men as well.
Yeah.
He is doing it. It's a twofold thing. And they end up becoming the same thing eventually. So at first, Jim says he's doing it for God, but he also is doing it for his own release. Well, Jim starts talking about how he doesn't believe in the fake sky God, that God's in all of us. So he starts adopting some of that Father Divine talk that we had earlier. So Jim starts identifying himself as God as well in the midst of all this. And the people are fucking buying it. They're sticking with it.
They're
100%.
into it. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, hey, is it how big of a compliment that you're getting fucking railed by God? You know?
Right.
All right.
Take me in the back, God.
So yeah, everybody's down for it.
Fuck
and
yeah.
something that's really fucking hilarious that happens in the PBS documentary, I believe it is, on Jonestown, is that a black man is interviewed and he didn't know anything about, you know, the sex that Jim Jones was having with everybody. So they're having a meeting at church. So what happens is the associate pastor gets up behind the pulpit and he gets up and he says, "Hey guys, listen, tonight, if anybody wants Father to fuck him in the ass, make sure you douche your ass." And this guy is like looking around and he's like, is everybody in here getting fucked in the ass? And like over half the people are like, yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We'll make sure we douche our asses for Father. And he's like, what? And then on a later occasion, Jim Jones actually comes up to this same gentleman, puts his hand on his shoulder and says, "How you doing, son?" He's like, "Oh, good, Father, good, Father." He goes, "Need Father fuck you in the ass?" And he's like, "No, I'm good. I'm good."
Well, if you need it, I'm here.
Yeah, if you need it, I'm here.
I'm here for you, buddy.
So, like, this is kind of like a lot of people's discovery until a certain point. It's just like out in the open.
Right.
Like it's common knowledge. I mean,
Right.
you got 1,000 people plus in your church at any given point. Like, and eventually, actually, Jim Jones in Jonestown, it ends at 7,000. But as far as total congregation, you know, you ain't going to be able to keep a secret.
No.
With
no.
7,000 people in any type of institution.
And if anybody's been to church, you know how the church is. So.
Oh, yeah. Very gossipy. Jim Jones comes back from Brazil, and the reason that he comes back from Brazil is because JFK gets assassinated, and he thinks that's a sign that he needs to return home. And,
Well,
panic
he
button
is
on.
God, so you know he needs to be.
and again, the Cuban Missile Crisis and
Right.
Russia being in bed with Cuba and supporting them, so on and
Right.
so forth. And
Right.
there was a lot of rumors and considerations. Again, I'll allude back to our Conspiracies episode where we talk about that, you know, Russia might have been behind the assassination on JFK. So, like, he just freaks out. He goes back. Whenever he gets back, this is like Jim's first big defeat. Like, he freaks the fuck out because his church is totally devastated. He left his church in the hands of his associate pastors. The church flaked off, broke off. Some people left, went here, went there, so on and so forth. I think he comes back and it's like below the hundreds, whenever it was in the multi-hundreds previously when he left. So it's totally in fucking shambles. So he just like freaks out. So Jim starts like cranking up, you know, his aggression and kind of some of his tactics. So then he starts instilling in people fear if we don't move from Indiana to California, this safe haven, away from, and Ukiah essentially is where they ultimately land. But I think the article was for Eureka, California in particular, but Northern California. Yeah. And the theory was that it was like upwind from the Sierra Mountains. So like, you know, if there was going to be nuclear contamination, that wouldn't affect that area in particular. Right. It was a safe haven.
They're blocked,
if you will.
right?
Right. He basically prophesies that there's going to be a nuclear attack. It's going to affect in the United States, and we have to move out to California. So him and about 60 some odd people essentially go out to California. And then he starts to grow the church there. Also, at some point, Jim comes back over to the East Coast on one of his trips, his sabbaticals, once he procures these buses I mentioned earlier, and when he's in California. And he even takes like an empty bus, thinking he's going to snipe out all these people from Father Divine's church.
I'm going to sign all these rookies.
Right. Father Divine dies. His previously mentioned 21-year-old wife, and now I think it's like 7 years later, so she's upper 20s,
right,
is now running the church. And she's the boss lady, which is, again, highly unusual and uncommon for the time. Jim comes to the church and tries to poach the members. And Jim plays the old catch-22. He shows up and says Father Divine jumps spirits into his body.
Oh, so now he's Father Divine.
He's Father Divine.
Yeah. And if you remember, Father Divine was God.
Right.
So now Jim is not only Father Divine, but he's also God.
He's everything.
Right? He's the Holy Trinity. He's Jim Jones.
all
He's
you
Father
need.
Divine. And this is where the Holy Trinity came from, folks.
Right.
If you didn't believe it, now here it is.
Right. Yeah. Here's your Trinity, baby.
So, Jim, it's a failure of a trip. Now, he did end up poaching a little over 50. I think it was like 60-something people from the church, maybe as many as 90. It's definitely under 100, and bringing them back. But it's not the success that he thought it was going to be. Right. So he's got all people fucking stacked in these Greyhounds like sardine cans coming back still yet, though, because they would try to take the most efficient trips. Jim got so big, going back to his administrative tasks and his responsibilities and his skills, like Jim was so good at his, like he was literally running every facet of the organization. All the businesses, he was doing all the administrative work. He was booking the buses to travel to his rallies and to his demonstrations and so on and so forth. And he was getting a lot of recognition politically too out on the West Coast. So like he actually started to have political people in his corner as well, and it became very beneficial to politics because they could call up Jim Jones, and Jim Jones could bring a bus of 700 people to political events.
Right.
So,
and when you have that influence over that many votes, that's,
right.
That's big to politicians
it can swing,
right.
especially you're talking municipal elections and things of that ilk.
Right.
Every vote counts in those situations.
Right.
Not only was he and all of his people now members, now he was recruiting people in the area. So Jim changed his focus, his recruitment from poor black people, quite frankly, to more middle-class white people, trying to bring them in, as well as younger people. Being out on the West Coast, there was a lot of people there essentially for socio or economical refuge in many respects. Big hippie movement out there, a lot of left-leaning politics started to blow up out there.
Right, the homosexual movement in San Francisco.
Right,
stuff
exactly
like
right. So like Harvey Milk, for example,
right.
one of the first openly gay politicians running for office, assassinated. Harvey Milk was even being courted by People's Temple at one point, even though they didn't publicly, support homosexuality, which is funny because the pastor's fucking all these dudes in the ass, mind you.
Right, but it's wrong. Right.
But yeah. And so that's going to lead me to another interesting point is some of the, beliefs that he started to adopt as well. And that's that Jim Jones just started saying that everybody was homosexual. Everybody was homosexual in the church, and anything else was just a front. That they were just covering it up. And he was the only straight man in the world.
You want me to fuck you. That's what he's saying up there. He gets up there in front of the congregation. He's looking them all in the eye. It's real quiet.
Right.
You want me to fuck you.
Who does God want tonight?
and this jumps down the timeline a little bit, but, Jim actually gets, his appetite for, butt fucking is just not satiated in his church walls anymore. Eventually, he gets caught lewd sex acts, which is kind of toward his paranoia that he has to eventually spur them moving. But, down to Guyana, Jim gets caught fucking some dude in a theater in LA in particular, a movie theater. The cop was it was said that the cop was totally pissed off about it because he had such political influence that he was not actually tried for having been caught, and the police officer was fucking outraged. And this is, of course, you think homophobia was bad in the 90s. Let's go back to the 1970s when this took place.
Oh yeah,
it was just as rampant, if not more so. It was way more there were not laws protecting homosexual people. There were not political organizations protecting homosexual people. So it doesn't have the support that it does today. It wasn't even viewed as a right to be gay, unfortunately. Talked kind of in detail about some of his homosexual activities. Well, Jim Jones was bi, obviously.
Right.
He went kind of both ways. Another thing he started to kind of get a little bit with his church people sideways with was, it come to find out he started to develop and get more paranoid, and he kind of created this inner committee, the planning committee, if you will. And even when his churches was in the 1,000 range, it was kind of his, exactly right. He created his own SS, which this is his more tight-knit heart of the community, the church inside the church, if you will.
Right.
This is where he really played. He actually had his own personal secretary. Things got fucked up with his wife at some point too, where he couldn't fuck his wife. She had bad back ailment of some sort. His secretary in his church, who he actually used as a plant many times in the audiences to pretend that she was crippled in a wheelchair.
And then he brings her up and heals her.
Yeah, he brings her up and heals her, and she runs and starts dancing around. There's famous footage of this. That's literally his secretary that's in that footage that gets up and starts running around circles and running up and down the aisle and flailing her hands around. She was in love with Jim Jones, and she was ugly as shit. He was not interested
He wanted
whatsoever.
nothing to do with her.
But his excuse for not fucking her was, and this is like his most loyal person, which eventually he has a second secretary who's just as loyal down the road. But like his reason for fucking her was that she was essentially too good and that she got to be in charge of his personal fuck schedule. So she selected, scouted, managed, and scheduled the talent for him to fuck inside
Jesus.
this inner circle of people. Yeah. All the girls. She was the girl pimp. She was kind of the Moolah or the Mae Young. Or which one of the old lady wrestlers was the pimp? I think it was Moolah. She's kind of the Moolah of professional wrestling in religion, if you will. She was pimping out the talent to people. There's a couple other interesting facts I don't want to pass by too bad as well. A part of this planning commission as well is this was a closed door meeting session. So he started locking up the doors, and the new rules started getting enforced. You can't leave the meeting. The meetings go on for 3-4 hours sometimes. No bathroom breaks. You couldn't sit down. If you did sit down, it had to be on the bare floor. You had to stand. So his intent was to make everybody uncomfortable.
Right.
And Jim, they kind of started out somewhat, I guess, comprehensive in some respects, cognitive, but then they started getting weird and ranty at times. Jim eventually came to despise his own rules, that he couldn't go to the bathroom as well. He had a piss bucket essentially set up inside of his pulpit. During these meetings, he would just be mid, and God's going to come down and into a fucking galvanized pail behind the pulpit. And people just went with it. They didn't think it was that odd.
Well, this man is God, so
right. Absolutely.
So if he wants to piss while he's talking to
exactly.
you, he's gonna fucking piss while he's talking to you.
And that progressed into it was known that some guy passed out and pissed himself too at the meetings. A lot of shit happened with people that couldn't withstand the marathon meetings.
And that's psychological. He knew exactly what he was doing.
And then it started to turn into he started doing this weird random shit. He had everybody prepare statements about him fucking them and read them in the planning commission, how great of a lover he was, how well endowed he was, how much pleasure he provided to them in their sessions.
I'm going to do this with my wife. I'm going to be I'm going to need an 800-word essay about how good this dick was last night. And I'm going to grade that motherfucker. So
next episode,
and
folks,
then you'll die.
Will actually be all of our spouses on here, and they're going to be reading about our sexual conquests. So next episode of ATI Pod, our wives are going to be reading about our sexual conquests. Thank you, ladies. We're committing.
We appreciate you.
This is Barrett from the ATI Podcast. Each week, Josh and I discuss current events, pop culture, music, TV, movies, politics, sports. Nothing is out of bounds. You can also tune in to learn about rising artists, small businesses, whether it's music, graphic design, filmmaking, or even a brick-and-mortar mom-and-pop shop. We will be spotlighting folks and their endeavors. Listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Anchor, or anywhere you enjoy your podcasts. Just search ATI Podcast. We would like to thank you for your continued support, and as always, please stay safe out there. Another kind of crazy thing that started to happen inside the temple too, in these closed door meetings, they started to elevate into these. So I talked about earlier the humiliation meetings that they would have where they bring somebody up who did something to infract the community. Well, then this started to turn into them literally making people derobe. So take off articles of clothing until they were stark naked in front of the entire church. And so they get stark naked in front of the entire church, and people would start to pick apart their body and be very shame them, cellulite, this, sort of shit. Or laughing at them, just what, anything and everything under the sun.
Right.
Well, Jim Jones, it was also rumored that at certain points he actually became very turned on by these events. And the apparatus that he had, it's not a far stretch to believe that perhaps he was wanking one in the spit can behind there, because it was said that he would have a very maniacal look about him, and he would look down at the edge of his nose and his glasses would start to slip down, kind of like that college professor that was tired of your shit,
right,
sort of thing, and look over the pulpit and even kind of grunt and
his shoulders are
lean over. So he was kind of giving him those into the microphone.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing too is like they like to record everything. There's like tons of recordings, even stateside, of Jim Jones like giving his sermons and everything. And again, you can see over time how they progressed and turned into like less believable, sermons.
Then he had like a trading card thing or like a picture of himself that he would give to people.
Yes.
And everything.
Yeah, he actually had a picture of himself too, and they would sign it, and then eventually, like in California, this was a part of their revenue making. They would go to events and they would make $7,000 alone on just selling his cards,
selling cards
to
right.
people.
I bet you,
And
like, even
no taxes. They got tax exempt status. They're a church, so on and so forth. Speaking of which, tax all the fucking churches.
Yeah, that's
100%.
another bullshit subject we could talk about, but I bet you those are still worth quite a bit of money today.
I guarantee if you have an original one, especially in good condition, who knows what something like that would go for.
Look that up.
Another thing that Jim Jones started to flip on about this time was his position on Russia. Now he started preaching about Russia being a safe haven for socialism and so on and so forth, and that they were going to come and save everyone and so on and so forth, or that they could be a safe haven in the event that things get too shitty in the United States in particular. Jim really you could kind of start to see the cracks. Like he was doing too much, but what he did do is he finally started to staff people inside the church, one of which was a cat named Tim Stone, which kind of became like his czar, if you will, in many respects. That's going to kind of come back to bite him in the ass later, but Tim Stone in particular is a very powerful, prominent attorney, and his wife Grace, and they started like being kind of some top officials inside the church and protected Jim Jones politically and legally, quite frankly, in many instances. And a lot of people, that lended to his credibility even more. And so about this time, too, there was some press that they were starting to get, and a writer had teased that he had an 8-part series that he was going to roll out that was very damning of the church. And it turned out to be very fucking pussycat mild and actually very complimentary of the church. And they even canceled the paper, even canceled it halfway through the series run because it was just like, it was absolutely nothing. They didn't reveal anything. There was nothing, that the reporter found. So this actually kind of helped boost him and his ego. And it kind of also made him feel a little bit more invulnerable in many respects. And so that was another really fucked up thing. Another thing, so Jim Jones's church started getting big. So like I mentioned earlier, he started somewhere in the 60s whenever he ended up starting the People's Temple Church. By the end of 66 in particular, his count was 86 members. In the end of the 60s, he had 500 members. Whenever he got caught wanking it or whatever he was doing with whomever in the movie theater, they had 3,000 members there in California. So this is before even including the Jonestown stuff that ultimately happened in 1978. So the church size grows and grows. He's got more people behind him. He's got more people with college educations, as I mentioned. Where he was kind of doing some of his recruiting earlier.
People with really good careers.
People with good careers.
Prominent members
lawyers,
of the community.
Members
right.
of the press.
Right.
Politicians. He really started to bankroll people of certain social statuses also. To get back kind of into some of the crazy things too about this time he started doing. So like he started doing fake poisonings. So he, like, for example, on the compound, one of the things that he did, which they weren't allowed to drink, is one night he said he was going to reward everybody, and they were actually farming grapes out in California as one of their enterprises. And he said, we're going to make this wine and we're going to all drink it. So he did in one of these PC meetings. And then after everybody drank, he told them that they drank poison. He actually had one of his secretaries stage a like dying convulsion freak out episode type thing too, because he was trying to goat people inside the church. This is how like deep his paranoia started to get. He tried to goat people inside the church to act out so he could weed them out. Like his vetting process inside the church just is a general attendee of the church. And then even into that layer of the church within inside the church, the planning committee, his vetting processes started getting more and more steep. He also like started employing like his own armed guard and things of that ilk. That really ramped up with his second fake assassination attempt in California, where he had been strolling the compound outside the compound and somebody shot at him. And this is where famously The nurse said that she was able to stick his finger inside of his body and pull the bullet out, but there was no sign of a bullet wound or damage on his shirt.
There was no wound.
So
yeah.
the word got out about this event and that he was staying, and again, to get back into his deity and his godlike powers, if you will, status. Word started to get out about this. The sheriff's department finds out about it, so they want to investigate, so they ask him for the shirt. Well, the shirt magically disappeared.
Yeah, it's gone.
Yeah. So now they can't find the shirt. So again, Jones was very cunning in many respects, avoiding law enforcement, avoiding media. He really had his ducks in a row, and you could start to see these more nefarious things starting to take place. So another of the kooky things that Jim Jones started to do as well that we got to hit on before we start moving out of the States is that he started keeping extensive notes on all of his members in the congregation as well. So they had kind of a Dewey Decibel system for fucking rats. People were he even employed members of the church spies to actually keep extensive notes on all of its members. And he literally filed them away so that he could use that information later if they tried to defect from the church, blackmail them or whatever the case is, which I'm going to tell an example once we get down to Jonestown of where this information kind of came into hand. Another thing that he did as well, outside of just keeping the notes, he started to really handle their own issues inside the church, regardless of whether they were a legal matter or not. So there was a member who got caught being a pedophile, and they ended up taking him into an interrogation room and setting his junk up on a table and just beating it with a rubber hose until it was unrecognizable. The motherfucker just got his genitalia pounded by a rubber hose. So they started employing kind of torture tactics for some of the things that people were doing. He would have boxing matches inside the church. He would have a 15-year-old boy box a 60-year-old woman for infracting things inside the church. And it was the person had to fight until they lost too. So if he did get a good fighter in there, he'd make them fight multiple people throughout the night until they dropped dead, essentially.
Jesus.
Out of exhaustion. So he got crazier and crazier and crazier with the punishments.
It would have been really cool if it was the top. You had to make it all the way to the top boss,
right?
Jim Jones. You got to fight Jim Jones.
If you defeat me, you fight
Final
God.
boss. And
you can't defeat God.
needless to say, Jim Jones never had to fight anybody. And of course, we would know the reasons why. So, it's not that he wasn't, relatively younger or anything, which actually a lot of people don't realize this. He was just, in his upper 40s whenever all the shit went down on the infamous day, if you will. So, he was, able-bodied in many respects. But, of course, if he would actually lose a fight publicly, that would totally take away from his entire, gimmick. He wouldn't lord over people in the same way. He wouldn't be as powerful as he was. He certainly wouldn't be God in many people's eyes. God should be able to do whatever to whomever in those respects. So
I was just thinking about Jim Jones. He just has suffered and suffered and suffered. He is the only God, and he don't even have a chance to enjoy himself here. And I wanted to say one more thing. This is one thing I want to say. That few that's gone, it's many more here. He's still, that's not all of us. That's not all yet. That's just a few that has got a chance to get to the one that they could tell their story to, their lives to.
So Jim, too, to stay on top of all this craziness going on inside the church and everything that he started to do, starts taking amphetamines to stay up with the times.
God,
and
this
his
guy
events,
is a
his wild
modern
schedule.
Hitler, dude. I'm just convinced, man.
Yeah.
He's a
You just-
modern Hitler.
You take someone like that, all this crazy, put some amphetamines on top of it.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
And then
It's a
what does he do to counterbalance the
recipe.
amphetamines? Quaaludes.
So you can sleep at
So he starts
night.
taking fucking Quaaludes so he could sleep at night. So this motherfucker's bouncing back and forth. He ends up actually employing an actual church doctor as well, who helps him with these things. But these drugs that he's on becomes a problem at home. I mean, obviously he's becoming a drug addict, but his son, Stephen, that I mentioned earlier, his only biological son, and this is where I got into kind of the hereditary talk with mental illness earlier. He attempted suicide several times just at the age of 13, I think it was. 3 times at the age of 12, excuse me, is what took place. He attempted suicide, and they were by taking Quaaludes. in particular. He tried to overdose on his dad's Quaaludes. He got in his Quaalude stash and took them. That right there tells you that there's an element of mental illness going on inside this family, without question, beyond. Stephen, unfortunately, he was kind of on the outs with the family in that respect. I mean, he stayed with the family, he was in the church and that sort of thing, but he and the eldest daughter were both really predominantly kind of the two that weren't as active in the church as the rest of the family. And coincidentally, I believe that they are the two that die, actually, ultimately, whenever the massacre takes place, is the two people that were like least involved in it. Like Jim Jones Jr., for example, he did a lot inside the church. And he survived it. And he's in many of the documentaries that you can find nowadays.
Right.
And of course, Jim Jones Jr., whom we referenced earlier, was the first black person adopted in 1961 in Indiana by the Jones family. You know, you can kind of see like things are just like spiraling out of hand. Things are getting crazy. These articles and things are starting to come alight. There's a threat that there's this huge expose going to start to take place. You know, like things start happening inside the church with what they refer to as the Gang of Eight. They're the 8 college-age kids that left the church, and they basically went like on a fucking Tony Robbins type like excursion and like smoking fucking weed in the desert and shit like that too on top of it. But they went around like public speaking, like to talk about it. The way I took the dynamic of the relationship, I'd like to do more of a study on the Gang of Eight specifically, but they just kind of seemed like kids that weren't like really their intent wasn't to like, you know, take the church down. It was more about their own personal, you know, benefit of like being public speakers and like trying to blackmail the church and so on and so forth. Jim Jones, at least publicly, or in most of the tapings that you'll find, like of recording meetings and stuff like that took place, he was about actually bringing them back and showing them compassion. Like there was these like weird, still like humane elements of Jim Jones still yet there, you know, when he was stateside. Now, ultimately, who knows what would have happened, but like at this point, it's not believed that the church is like killing people, right?
Right. Just while it's happening, right?
Right before we decided to take off from California, too, we got to mention the fact that Jim Jones started to franchise his own church and his own brand with the People's Temple. So he started to move south. So, you know, Ukiah is where they kind of started things off here. He started to move down towards San Francisco and LA and start having churches there. So I know that it was like near the 3,000 mark whenever he finally started to start making those moves toward paradise, essentially, which is, you know, the Jonestown settlement. Jonestown settlement, we'll mention that while we're here. So that was kind of their excursion to create their ultimate paradise, you know, their utopian society, if you will.
Be self-sufficient and everything like that.
You know, when it comes to utopian societies, of course, if you've read any good book about a utopian society, we know exactly where utopian societies ultimately lead. And it ends up with people like more nefarious pulling the puppet strings. They start out, and they're not equipped for developing out Guyana at this time. We're talking about South American jungle in the bush. I'm pretty sure like whenever they showed up and started clearing land out, they actually saw late 90s animated Disney Tarzan in the woods with Phil Collins as they started to clear the bush back, just like hanging out and smoking a lot of fucking peyote and making music. This tells you how thick this jungle is. Cartoon Tarzan might pop up here. They would send down equipment from the United States and it would like break down on them. Like the church was just like burning money on equipment down there, just trying to develop and clear the land out. Like their chainsaws literally broke the minute that they tried to cut the trees.
Dozers and stuff.
I think dozers. They blow up motors inside of dozers and everything else. Like they did not have the faculties to do it. And like they actually employed a lot of the natives to help them clear the jungle, and they were more adept to do it. But they're like clearing the jungle with like hand tools by comparison, which you think, but it's more about the wood fibers and how strong that they were, even though that they looked flimsy and kind of were in some respects. It was more of a precision that you had to take, not a blunt a dressing of clearing like you would in excavation sometimes, They burn up the equipment, they're burning up money, and Jim Jones himself at least knows that this is not going as well as perhaps I planned to do it. But everything he ever reported was great. Everything was always great.
Right.
You know, nothing, he would never concede defeat whatsoever. But as we mentioned earlier, as Jim Jones started to get kind of more and more of this recognition in the media in a negative fashion, so like the Gang of Eight was kind of a first of string of blemishes on his record, if you will. it came to that there was many defectors inside the church that left the church on many occasions. So they started to be approached by media, and essentially what was going to happen was that there was going to be a large article published where they interviewed several people in the church. This was a substantiated article. They took pictures of the people. They interviewed family members from the church. Like these reporters did their work for this article.
Right.
And it was going to damn him to hell. So Jim gets fucking paranoid. They get a plane. Even his second secretary that I mentioned earlier that he started to employ, this one was like his favorite sex buddy.
So he would fuck this one, right?
Yes, he would fuck this one. And there was a lot of jealousy between the two on account of it, the two secretaries. He would fuck this one. She even got her aviator's license so that she could fly him on a whim. So essentially, like a thief in the night, they decided to escape California. And now we're headed down to Guyana, to the Jonestown settlement. So they get down there, and immediately it like booms from like 50-something people to 500 people. And they don't have the land cleared. They don't have the beds. They don't have the facilities.
Right. You can look in some of the documentaries and see like the buildings they built using like banana leaves and, you know.
Yeah, the food was scarce. They didn't have enough resources to produce as much as they needed for that amount of people.
Right. Exactly. And also he would send back pictures, though, once he got there, of like he would actually go to local markets and purchase fruit and stuff and like come back and pretend as if that was their crops that they were harvesting, send them back home.
Right. And they did some, well, we'll get into that, but before the press came and the senator came and stuff, I think they did some of that too.
Right.
Kim Jong-un is really famous for doing that when he has any kind of Western media in the country.
Right.
He'll like fill up the grocery stores and take them to specific ones that are full of food and you know.
And another thing that we should mention, too, who also made the trip with the Jones family is Mr. Muggs. Mr. Muggs is the mascot of the pet chimpanzee of the church that is the mascot of People's Temple. So Mr. Muggs made the travel from California down.
This guy and fucking monkeys, dude.
And Mr. Muggs was like a personal bodyguard for him in many respects as well.
I mean, a chimpanzee,
He was stout, and he would like protect him, and they like communicated with sign language. Like it was a very intelligent. I mean, monkeys are intelligent anyways, and intelligent animals.
He might have had a relationship with the monkey.
I would not be surprised. Like nothing would surprise me with Jim Jones. He's probably fucking the monkey in the ass too. And that is the premise of Outbreak, folks.
Pretty much.
So Mr. Muggs, they had to keep him in a cage half the time.
Right.
Because they're in a jungle.
Right.
He's
going to
escape.
let a chimpanzee roam around in the jungle.
Oh, yeah. There was all kinds of... And that's the other thing. Like, once you made it to Jonestown, there was no getting out of Jonestown. The bush was so thick.
Right.
Like, you couldn't even walk a mile into the jungle, do a 360 in the jungle, and be totally lost and not know where you're at.
Yeah.
You can never navigate your way out of the jungle.
Right.
If the jungle itself, just the navigation didn't get you, there was obscene amounts of poisonous snakes at the time and jungle cats. Mm-hmm. So, like, they would literally eat people, and the forest was so dense, like with vegetation, sunlight wouldn't even escape past the canopy in many respects and get down to the floor level of the jungle. Right. So it would be like pitch black dark, but so daytime in some places inside there. So it was impossible to navigate.
Right.
So you're there, you're there, you ain't getting out.
Right.
So another thing, he had to get tight. Jones had to get tight with, local embassy, this, that, the other thing. And he still had political allegiances back home. But this article starts to get out. Family members of the church start freaking out. And they start getting a hold of area representatives, so on and so forth. So this is getting the flames stoked.
Right. And getting the authorities involved and stuff.
You'll regret it if you don't die. You'll regret it.
Too many people?
I saved them, but I made my example. I made my expression. I made my manifestation, and the world was not ready for me. Paul said I was a man born out of due season. I've been born out of due season just like all we are, and the best testimony we can make is to leave this goddamn world. Peace.
Also, Jim did a lot of other things that kind of essentially made his own bed, if you will. So we talked about how it started out within the 50s and then it turned into 500 very quickly. Well, that 500 very quickly turned into nearly 1,000 people that were down in Jonestown. So we talked about earlier that they weren't developed out enough. I mean, this population boom took place over the course of, I think it was less than 18 months. All these people there, not enough food. So they're down to 2 meals a day is what they're eating, and they're working at least 11 hours a day. Now, that seems like, compared to what I mentioned earlier, but you had to consider the conditions. You are in the jungle.
Yeah, you're working in the jungle.
Also,
and you're working to survive. It's
right.
different. You know what I mean?
Also, the demographic of the people that are there. A third of the people are elderly. A third of the people are children, so we're talking 17 age and under. And then a third of them are working class, middle-aged, able-bodied people
so
to do the work.
A third is
so
taken
essentially,
care of.
Jungle natives that they've employed, teenagers, and the working class adults are the ones that are putting in the manual labor type work. So you're talking 300, you know, it's a little over 900, almost 1,000 that ultimately were there again, as I mentioned earlier. So you're talking like when we're splitting those demos up, we're talking in the 300 range per. So that's only so much work you can get done in a day, even in working in shifts and things of that ilk, even as the property developed out. Another thing that happened while they were down there with Jim Jones, now things escalated on the punishments. So and then they started to make a solitude chamber to start punishing people in. Then Jim started using his note cards on what he had on people. So they were like, for example, there's this black lady, elderly black lady, that had a vicious fear of snakes. And you can actually hear in some of the Jonestown tapes her actually being like publicly ridiculed, and a boa constrictor was made to be put on her, and she had to take it. And she alludes to it having happened previously, but this is the only documentation of it.
Right.
So, you know, what you actually heard was only a fraction of what actually happened out there.
Right.
Also, for some fucking reason, Jones felt the need to have another fake assassination attempt down there. So he actually has his son, I think it's Jim Jones Jr., go out to the bush line and shoot back up toward the pavilion where he's at.
Right.
Now, to give you an idea, if you've ever seen the movie The Sacrament by Ty West, came out like 2011, I want to say. It's actually heavily inspired by Jonestown and Jim Jones specifically. Like, they literally recreated their set is a recreation of the layout in Guyana specifically. So the pavilion that you see in that, and kind of the head of that, is where Jim's would give a lot of his in-person sermons.
Yeah, you're talking like
there.
that big tabernacle looking.
Right.
Yeah.
So he had his son go out in the woods and shoot up toward him. And again, they staged an event in which, you know, it made it look like he survived another assassination attempt. And then they went on to say that was the CIA sending people down.
Right. He's making an enemy. He's trying to not be the enemy. He's creating an enemy for the church.
Right. And there's people too now. Everybody gets homesick, right? So there's people. There's a low murmur, like in the lower 10 percentile, probably even down to 5%, of people in Jonestown specifically. They're starting to get homesick. They want to go back home. They want to be back with their families, so on and so forth. And that's natural. And they would sometimes let people go back home, but it had to be for purposes like Tim Stone, for example, his right-hand man. He would go back home and execute something politically for him, or deliver money to somebody, or bring money back, or whatever the case, you know, just kind of more logistics type stuff.
There was a purpose. Right.
Well, Tim Stone's wife, Grace, started to get tired of the shit in the church, and she wanted to leave the church. And she got mad that Tim was gone all the time, so she wanted to take on another lover, essentially, is the short of it. They wanted their issues to be fixed. They take him to Jim Jones. Jim Jones comes up with this fucking amazing concept that he's going to fuck Grace and impregnate her with his child, and that's going to keep them all tied back into the community, and they can't leave. And then this is going to be Jim Jones's heir to the throne, if you will.
It's Jesus.
Yeah, essentially. Yeah. That's exactly what they're going for. So he does this. Now this starts Tim Stone having resentment toward Jim Jones because he didn't want to lose his wife. He was only a victim of circumstance.
Well, I'm sure he didn't want Jim Jones to fucking impregnate his wife.
Yeah, exactly right. So then Jim Jones, to further this fucking wild situation, had them both write statements. Her writing that she enjoyed thoroughly being fucked by father, and that he impregnated her, and that she enjoyed every minute of the conception, and blah, 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 blah. And then him writing, him being Tim Stone, writing that he gave him permission to do so, being Jim Jones, to fuck his wife because he was unable to produce a child himself. So that's like, you know, really some kind of almost cuck shit, you know, like tucking your balls for sure.
Oh, yeah.
And it just humiliated him, and it ate at him. Like, I'm sure there was some immediate humiliation, but really what aided him, what really got Tim to turn away from him altogether, Jim Jones, is this kid. And he turns 6, and Grace at some point like leaves and wants to take the kid with her, and then they send the kid back to Jonestown, so the kid's in Jonestown, and Tim is actively trying to get the kid out of Jonestown now. And so Tim's like writing letters to political officials and so on and so forth.
Help
Yes.
me. That's what he's
and
saying.
Jim Jones is getting called for court hearings stateside that he's not showing up to. So then they start working with the Guyana embassy, and then they start having court hearings in Guyana that Jim Jones isn't showing up to. So this, paired with the article that got released in California right after he left, paired with other people coming forward, other family members coming forward and saying, hey, he called my mom and I was selling her house and moved down there, and we can't get a hold of her, and she can't leave, and she's senile,
So
or whatever the
basically
case
the
is.
walls are crumbling in on Jim Jones.
Absolutely. So he starts to like ramp up a comical anecdote to the side real quickly too. I got to mention, in the midst of these like days, he has people working out in the jungle for like 11 hours plus and having 2 meals a day and so on and so forth. Like, it's clear that these people are emaciated, right? So like, there's no way that you're not.
Right.
Jim Jones somehow kept getting fatter while he was there.
That dude was feasting.
Well, the guy's on fucking meth though, too. So you got to keep in mind what that does to you as well. But somehow he was getting fatter, so fat that they had to actually order shirts from the United States to be sent down because they could not get their hands on shirts
down there in Venezuela.
Right. Which is absurd, right?
Even the meth
Also,
could keep him getting fat.
Jim gets back into his spirit of loving basketball in particular.
Oh, God.
And so they start their own People's Temple basketball team that competes in Guyana, and they get their asses handed to them constantly.
That's so good.
In competition.
That's so good.
And he would go back and tell everybody that didn't attend the event that they won. And he would preach about how they won and how much they won by. And,
which was total bullshit.
And extravagant fat. I mean, this is like Donald Trump shit 101 right here.
Yeah.
Like, just completely no shame whatsoever. And then it just got to the ridiculous point that they were losing so much and by such a drastic fashion that the lies just became about him lying about how much they lost by. So then he finally conceded to the fact that they lost, but then they only lost by like, if we had made that shot there at the end, we would have won.
Right.
Things like that.
2 points. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And, his drug-induced states, Jim used to be able to command a crowd. His diction was fantastic. Again, we talked about some of the other, speech tactics that he employed.
Right.
He was able to command a crowd. He always had the right things to say in the right situations, even when confronted, even when bucked against. And people did occasionally buck against him in the meeting, but he would bring them up and they would discuss it and they would work it out.
Right. He's witty, for sure.
Yes, absolutely. He was like, he had that, off the cuff resolution ability. As he started taking the drugs, he started to lose that ability. So you can hear in some of the tapes and the recordings of the services that they had that he actually started to mispronounce words, slur words. He like randomly came up with this lisp all of a sudden.
Yeah, it almost sounds like a speech impediment, like with his front teeth or something like that.
He was also trying to like model his voice a different way too.
Right.
I think towards the, when the amphetamines came in, mixing that with the amphetamines and him going. And
he would actually hold mock depositions and trials inside of the camps too, to where he would act like he was interrogating people that the CIA was infiltrating. And he would even openly talk about it in his meetings, in his sermons, that the CIA was trying to infiltrate the group. And he would like bring people up and do sample trials and questions and interrogations and what have you. He's cracking at the seams now. It's being public. People are knowing. And like some people are occasionally slipping out here and there. Not in great fashion, once again,
Right.
Just very minimal. That paired with what I mentioned earlier, what was going on at home, he gets the attention of Representative Leo Ryan. Now, Leo Ryan was, is often forgotten in the Jamestown tragedy in many respects, but he was a California Democrat. Ryan was very unconventional in his politics in many ways. He once had himself locked up in Folsom Prison so he could see what the conditions were like, so he could actually think from the perspective of the prisoners, and he actually legislated for a lot of more humane implementations and strategies and administrative decisions and things of that ilk. And then also he actually famously went after like seal beaters. Like seal beating was a huge thing for the longest time.
Yeah.
It probably still is, but you don't hear about it as much.
Right.
But he actually chased seal beaters from the United States into Canada, specifically. Like, this dude was like a modern day, like, fucking Dog the Bounty, or like previous version of Dog the Bounty Hunter, like with a little less of a mullet. So, and I don't think he was on meth, but you know that Dog the Bounty Hunter's been on meth at some point. So anywho, but yeah, so Leo Ryan gets involved. The relatives of his constituents in particular would write him letters. So, and I want to mention the mail too. So, like, you know, everybody in the temple thought that they could write letters to whoever and go back home. They're like under this veil of reality that wasn't real, if you will. So they would write letters to family members back home, and family members would write letters to the people down there. Well, Jim Jones was giving these sermons at the time, like, America's in political warfare, it's rioting everywhere, it's this, it's that, America's about to get a nuke dropped on it, there's nuclear fallout. Like, he just giving the craziest fucking spiels.
Right. And people don't have TV or news or...
Right. They no TV.
No correspondence with family. Right.
So they're like starting to stage letters. Like, they're keeping people from getting the letters that they're writing. But then, like, where this kind of started to crack at the same as people at the temple started comparing letters with each other, and like they were writing from the same place. It was the same handwriting. Like to me, if like Pam wrote me a letter, my wife, I would know that was not, if it wasn't her handwriting, right?
Or even if it was her writing it,
like it should be like
tell.
Some of this seems kind of laughable to me,
right?
You know, but supposedly this was a thing where people didn't catch on to it immediately, and then they started to compare each other's notes,
right?
And so,
when you got to talk about these people were heavily manipulated too.
Oh yeah, and again, it kind of gets into that thing where an inch became a mile and became 3 miles. And now you're in fucking Guyana in South America, and you're
stuck.
You're getting fucked in the ass by the pastor.
Make your bed, you lay in it, baby.
Speaking of making beds and laying it, Jim Jones also at this time had a sex slave who was drug induced constantly. And it was one of the attempted early escapees who didn't want to have sex with Jim Jones. She turned down his advances. No, his secretary made this happen, actually.
She was off the books.
Yeah.
Oh, she was orchestrating this.
Yeah. She like was orchestrating this actually happening. And so Jim had like his only like fuck palace, like his own little den. And like his slaves would be confined to that area or whatever appointment he had for the day.
I just see Jim Jones laying on a jaguar skin, fucking black guys on it. You know what I mean?
Just
it's
like
crazy, dude.
Mr. Muggs is in the side,
in the cage.
Mr. Muggs is in the corner, slowly smoking a cigarette, filming it the whole time. He's waking his meat in the corner.
Right.
Yeah. So, anywho, another thing that kind of controversy that popped up too inside the church. I'm not sure exactly timeline where this happened, but certainly we want to mention it before we get to the ultimate demise, is that Jim got approached for not fucking enough black people in the church. So like apparently Jim predominantly fucked white. Now there is records of him fucking black people too.
Right.
But it was an extreme minority. So whenever he was confronted about it in one of these planning committee meetings, he said it was because that white women had a bourgeois attitude that he had to fuck out of them, and that black people didn't, and that's what made them more superior in race.
That's how he's playing. He's playing on people's emotions.
Oh yeah. And people heard that, and they were like, "Oh, I can get behind that. That makes a lot of sense."
That's normal. That's normal.
Yeah,
That's
exactly
normal,
right.
Father.
And he takes another one for the team, right?
Right.
Die with respect. Die with a degree of dignity. Lay down your life with dignity. Don't lay down with tears and agony. There's nothing to death. It's like Max said, it's just stepping over into another plane. Don't be this way. Stop this hysterics. This is not the way for people who are socialist, communists to die. No way for us to die. We must die with some dignity.
Another thing that's happening very, very rampantly in this as well is that women are getting pregnant with Jim Jones's baby, and they're all about abortions. Jim Jones saw abortion as just an inconvenience to his release, is literally his words. So, like, it was common that they were getting abortions inside. Jim Jones did end up knocking
Guyana
abortion.
Yeah, jungle
I feel like that
abortions.
should be like the punchline to a joke that's not been explored enough, you know? It's like she's got to, she's going to get one of those Guyana abortions. It's probably kind of like the abortion that my mom tried with me. It was kind of a coat hanger in the backseat of a old Chevrolet.
Right.
But it didn't really work out, Mom. Nice miss.
Well, you got to get on that same table that the guy had his junk mashed on.
Yeah, exactly. The sanitary conditions alone, I'm sure,
Well, if
were
all you
fantastic.
people in Texas need an abortion, don't forget about the Guyana
Yeah.
abortion.
Yeah.
So,
You go down to Jonestown.
Go on down to Jonestown, still there.
Is it? I don't know.
But so his secretary that he did like to fuck all the time did end up getting pregnant, and she took a little sabbatical to go have the baby with her family, and then came back as well. So she was allowed to have the baby in this instance because it was a reward that he gave her for being so loyal, essentially. And she was all about it. And she had a husband, and that was the surrogate father, and they were all cool with it. So back to Leo Ryan. So Leo Ryan, of course, he eventually gets his way in. He gets accepted to come down to Jonestown. Leo Ryan comes down, and they practiced for this visit. So everything went smashingly. Couldn't win it more perfect. And there's actually documentation again on YouTube of this.
right. Were there a news crew actually with?
Yeah, he brought reporters with him. He brought some of the family members that wrote him that were wanting to come back to see their beloved,
Right.
if you will. He brought quite the, I think it was somewhere in the 40s or so that he brought down with him. I mean, it was quite the entourage, if you will. So they show up, and they get off the airstrip. They're welcome. They're brought into the town. Right away, they noticed armed guards outside the city.
Right.
And then Jim Jones, of course, we mentioned earlier, has his own militant guards, if you will.
Yeah, they're like his armed bodyguards.
Yeah. And so they're like safeguarding him constantly. So the presentation's obviously a little off at first, but then they come to see like this is a socialist haven. This is everything that they said it's going to be. Everybody's got a job. Everybody's got a purpose. Everybody's putting forth the effort. Like Rep Ryan becomes like ultra impressed. Like there's footage of him going on like, I was like a little concerned about coming down here, but everything's on the up and up,
Right.
It's great.
Right.
It really is great. And he's like, I commend you for the work that you're doing and everything. Literally, as this conversation's going on, people inside the temple, so members that were there, were passing off notes, thinking that they were handing them off to representatives, cabinet, but they're actually handing them off to reporters. So the reporters are making a big scene about it.
Right.
Whenever they get them. And so like it's caught on footage like, hey, why are they saying they want to go? So this is kind of the famous...
A bunch of them are wanting to flee with
Right.
the representative, right?
And so a lot of people want to flee. There's kind of a bit of a panic and pandemonium that breaks out. And so like they get in an argument with Jim Jones specifically on camera. And Jim Jones just tries to talk it up to a few people lying. If they want to leave, it's fine. It's no big deal. Go do your thing.
Right.
And he tries to act like everything's, still yet on the up and up. So secretly he kind of lets whoever leave quietly. And I believe, like, if you were to do it in percentages, it's about 3% of the people. So it doesn't sound like a lot. And they were actually preparing for about 10% to leave the community. So 3% of the people end up leaving and going with the congressman. And this is kind of infamously where the death tape starts off at. This is where they're recording, and he's having Jim Jones is holding court under the pavilion. And the pavilion, he's starting to lay out a prophecy that the senator is going to be attacked. And then even right in the middle of the death tape, you can hear where he says, the senator's been killed. The senator's been killed.
Right.
So he obviously had the senator killed with some of his armed guards. They were shot on the runway. Amazingly, some people did survive, and there's eyewitness accounts of what actually took place, even some footage.
Yeah, that's
still
say.
yet.
I think there is some footage of actually some of the perpetrators firing weapons at him and stuff from the news crew that was there.
There is footage, pictures. There's kind of some famous pictures, too, of Representative Ryan whenever they're actually leaving the compound, already has blood on him. That's a failed assassination attempt on him. They snuck off into some private room, and I guess some guy who's trying to muster up the courage to actually slit his throat. Representative Ryan's throat, couldn't really get down with it, and he stopped him. And so the blood that's on his shirt is like whenever he stopped the assassination attempt and was leaving the compound.
Damn.
Well, he was starting to leave the compound, but he had decided when this took place, I believe also is initially Representative Ryan was going to leave with everybody at the compound, the 40-something people. He ends up not. He just ends up deciding that he's going to stay back in case anything else manifests itself that's, not on the up and up.
Right.
So this is where the failed assassination attempt comes. So then he goes fleeing the compound, I think, is how that kind of plays out. Another thing that was discovered as well there in Jonestown, unfortunately, after the act that took place, was a farewell note that was written from what they believed to be Richard Trope. At least 2 farewell notes were left behind in Jonestown, including the unsigned letter that is often attributed to Richard Trope, a teacher and a writer for the temple. That letter eloquently explained why it was necessary for the temple and its members to commit suicide, and Jim Jones didn't order the attack on Congressman Ryan or his party. The letter concludes, "If anybody understands, it matters not. I am ready to die now. Darkness settles over Jonestown on its last day on earth." However, some of the survivors today do dispute that was actually Trope's letter and farewell note. Tim Carter, which is is probably the most prominent survivor and has written many books, is one of those doubters, and he says that on the day of the tragedy, he witnessed Trope actually arguing with Jones against the suicide plan before Jones actually made his speech and made his followers at the pavilion consume the flavor aid that was contaminated with cyanide. So I mentioned the death tape earlier where it starts. Congressman Ryan and his folks head off to the plane. So this is when Jim starts his sermon. Jim starts to, as I mentioned earlier, prophesy that the congressman's going to be shot dead. Then eventually reveals that the congressman is shot dead, but he's telling everybody he needs to lay down their life, that he's tired of this shit, that, they did what they did and they're dying in protest to what they're going to ultimately do. And he's using a lot of like fear mongering, obviously, as one would in these situations,
right.
That the youth and the elderly, so the children and the elderly in particular, are going to be tortured by the CIA, raped. I mean, just like everything that you can imagine nefariously. The death tape kind of cuts in and out, and Jones does hit the mute button semi-routinely, sometimes seemingly for no reason. And you can tell there is, one argument that takes place. It's an elderly black woman in the church that was known to be kind of a pain in Jones's ass in many respects that would actually refute. And she asks him, why not go to Russia? That's the safe haven you keep telling us about. And Jones just dismisses it and says, Russia doesn't want us. They aren't going to want us. Do you think they're going to have the capacity to come pick up all of us at one time? Do you think that that the U.S. is going to allow that? Just kind of just poking holes in it the whole time. So then she tries to pivot her conversation into at least sparing the youth. And then Jim starts to make this whole argument that actually killing the children was the most humane thing to do, and that parents having the option to die with their children is a humane choice. So this is where they start the line, and they start with the children, and the flavor aid and cyanide are served up, and they're forcing the drink down the throats of babies and children. And if they don't take it, they're injected with syringes. So not to say that like everybody there was injected with syringes. When I say syringes, we're talking 2 different types. We're talking kind of the baby style syringes, like the oral ones.
Right.
And then we're also talking like needle syringes. So both things did happen. And many of the needles that they found inside of people's bodies were bent. So that infers forcibly entered into somebody's body.
Right.
So that in and of itself as well, obviously shows that there was some force, there was some resistance. People did not want to go down with this deed.
You got to move. Are you going to get the medication here? You got to move. Marston, there's about 40 minutes.
You have to move, and the people that are standing there in the aisle go stay in the radio room yard, but everybody get behind the table and back this way, okay? There's nothing to worry about. Everybody keep calm and try and keep your children calm. And the older children can help love the little children and reassure them.
Who wants to go with their child has a right to go with their child. I think it's humane. I want to see you go, though. They can take me and do with me whatever they want to do. I want to see you go. I don't want to see you go through this hell no more. No more, no more, no more. We're trying. If everybody will relax, the best thing you do to relax, then you will have no problem. You'll have no problem with the thing if you just relax. All you can do, all they're doing is taking a drink to go to sleep. That's what death is, sleep. But of it, I'm tired of it all.
And so then that progresses into kind of the elderly and the older class. And it seems to be like no rhyme or reason made to these decisions, but there's people that escape the compound. Like, there's eyewitness reports of somebody just going up to a guard and saying, I want to leave because I want to be able to tell the story of what happened here. And they let him.
Right.
There's another one that says that I don't believe. There was another instance of a temple member saying that I believe with the killings, and the guards let him go.
Right.
In fact, somebody confronted Jones, and Jones allowed him to go. But there was other instances where, like a young 20-year-old mother was forced to take the poison along with her daughter, but it was drug up toward the altar.
Right.
Toward Jones's kind of figure-headed area where they had the table set up for the Kool-Aid and what have you. And you can actually hear on the tapes, like crying.
And her trying to console her. And
Jim tries to say, too, that this is the humane way for them to die, that there's no pain and yada yada on the death tapes. When you drink cyanide, it is a very painful death.
Oh,
essentially, it's a poison that dehydrates you. You start to foam from the mouth. You go into convulsions, and it's usually no shorter than 5 minutes that it takes you to die. It could be up to 20 and even 40 minutes in some instances.
So a lot of people probably suffered. Right.
So it's a long, slowing death in many respects.
And it's not like everybody's taking it all at the same time. Like it took, 4 or 5 hours?
Right.
Yeah, so they're sitting there watching people drop.
Right.
Yeah.
Over a period of 5 hours,
So
right.
just holding that cup, watching everybody just...
Yeah.
Speaking of 4 or 5 hours, yes, it took about 4 hours for everybody to, quote unquote, die. The secretary that we mentioned earlier that was Jones's favorite, she can be heard on the death tapes giving instructions on how to file up in line with the children to drink the Kool-Aid and what have you. I keep saying Kool-Aid, but it's Flavor Aid, okay? So Kool-Aid, don't come after us.
Right.
It is Flavor Aid.
Kool-Aid,
And people do commonly say it's Kool-Aid. Hell, I mentioned it earlier. That's the popular saying, don't drink the Kool-Aid. It's actually Flavor Aid, which is a knockoff. Right. So, and another interesting fact...
Did she commit suicide? The
yes.
secretary?
Yeah, we're going to get there.
Okay.
So, she was basically tasked with staying behind. So she's the other letter that was found at the Jamestown compound.
Okay, yeah. I think I remember this from the documentary I watched.
She ends up basically left behind. Her task was to just kind of clean everything up. It's believed that she actually shot Jim Jones in the head. Jim Jones died by a blunt gunshot to the head.
Right.
So it's believed that she shot Jim Jones, that she made sure that everybody's poison and everything went through. There was even instances where people took it both orally and took the shots, I guess under the impression that it would make it more effective, or if one thing didn't work or the other. Yeah, we don't know. We don't.
Right.
We can only assume.
Right.
So, there's a lot that we still don't even know today, because unfortunately there's so little survivors, and the survivors that there are, not to say that they didn't witness any of the horrors, but a lot of them were people that kind of got out for the shit hit the fan sort of deal in many respects. So, but she was one of the last, and kind of ominously, leaves a letter that says that essentially it was all worth it. Is paraphrasing the ending of her letter. So I mentioned earlier that 2 of Jones's 5 kids had died there. Actually, the 3 other children had been sent with a task out of the community to accomplish, and they came back and actually found everybody dead. Otherwise, they probably would have been caught in it. And one of the 3, of course, is Jim Jones Jr. in that group of folks. And I guess by process of elimination, the other would be the other minorities, coincidentally. So the Native American girl, as well as, the Native American and the Korean persons. It was also found that Jim at least believed somewhere thereabouts, FBI seized about $10 million in accounts that Jones just had himself. The church had over $30 million in assets when it was all said and done.
But Jim had $10 million in his personal money.
Yeah.
Right.
And there's a lot of money that they didn't recuperate from the compound as well. And the People's Temple in and of itself, because they did get into that early fad of offshore accounts and what have you. And there's still money today that has not been recuperated that is in offshore accounts from this Jonestown stuff.
Yeah.
Which is crazy to even consider.
Yeah.
Or even think about. Unfortunately, over 900 people lost their lives Again, we're talking, at the time it was viewed as a mass suicide, but really the arguments there, I have heard people just like laugh that it's even referred to as that. Certainly some of these people were doing it willingly, but whenever you get into that cult mindset,
right, and you
being
talk
directed and goaded, and this goes back to our very first episode, the January 6th insurrection talk.
Right.
These ideas and thoughts are planted into people's minds, and he, with reason, Jones, recruited these people to be in his church.
Right.
Whether they were of lower cognition or they had circumstantial issues. I mean, like another thing that he did is he went and recruited criminals and drug addicts specifically, cleaned them up. And, people like that, whenever they have an opportunity to flourish in a community with no, concerns, coincidentally, most of them were like used for his personal guard as well, but neither here nor there. Like those people like really buy into shit, even if it's crazy, because it's better off than what they had previously.
Right.
There's no contesting that. And then you're also dealing with like kind of other psychological phenomenons that go on, like hive mind and those sorts of things too.
Right.
So, I think it's an amalgamation of things, of course. There's people that truly believe the cause that willingly took their lives, regardless of whether or not they were inspired to do so. Like, even in his faked assassination attempts, his faked suicide displays that Jim Jones conducted on his people, like there wasn't a lot of instances of his people like freaking out about fake poisonous like ingestion. Like they were like largely down with it. Like, so this is something that had been inbred into them to be a commonality or a real possibility, if you will, on account of that.
Right. He did it like over the years.
Right.
Of his running of the church.
Right.
We'll just do a trial run.
Ultimately, I mean, even listening to the death tape, I think Jim Jones bears most of the responsibility. I mean, obviously 100% of the responsibility, but to make an argument that, he's not responsible and some people willingly chose to take their life, I mean, I think that's kind of absurd in my opinion, but...
Yeah, and I could see how somebody might make the argument, but really at the end of the day, I land on that side as well.
Yeah, is
that these people would have never been there in the first place if it wasn't for Jim
Jones.
Specifically.
He's responsible for the whole situation. So,
I just kind of historically wanted to put in context too. Like I wanted to go and see like other historical mass suicides, kind of the more popular stuff. So this was actually kind of chilling. So I just went for a straight up search on in some of the earliest reports of them in Ottoman Empire specifically, which is wild because Jones actually alludes to this in some of his recordings, is the suicides in the Ottoman Empire specifically. So this motherfucker was obviously a study of history, as if we didn't already spell that out earlier. Like he was getting ideas from historical events that took place. So Ottoman Empire is kind of the first example, and I'm not going to do them all, but I want to make a mention of a few of them just so you can kind of see the numbers. Some of these have numbers, when they happened, and then actually one of these is going to lay the groundwork for our next cult episode that we'll eventually do too. So number 2, historically, that I want to mention was the Suli region in 1803 near Greece. And this is where tons of women and children jumped off cliffside, and there's monuments there today for doing so, for Turkish invaders were coming in. So that was kind of another, like really, and that kind of thematically is the more popular examples of mass suicides over the years, are essentially people that lost some, a position in war, or were being invaded, if you will.
Yeah, like the Japanese and the ritualistic suicide, not surrendering to the Americans.
Exactly,
and stuff
right.
Like that.
So 3 is the Puputan, which is Balinese for suicide example, and that's Indonesian people. They committed suicide to, again, ward off or not be victim of what the Balinese people were doing. 250 people died then. The 4th example, to your Japan talk, Josh, 1944, right after the Battle of Saipan, General Saito did promise elite spiritual status for anybody who took their life and did not surrender to the U.S.
Right. Yeah.
So that was a big number there.
An interesting fact with that goes all the way back to samurais.
Yes.
Samurais ritualistically killed themselves if they were unable to
escape a situation. essentially.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Right. My number 5 example here is Berlin after the Nazi fall in World War II. Just in Berlin alone, over 7,000 Nazis killed themselves.
Right.
Or people supporting the Nazi party.
Right.
That is just in Berlin. That's not the whole of Germany and every Nazi-occupied area.
Yeah.
So that's wild to consider as well. 7,000 people jumping out of windows, off of buildings.
Eating cyanide capsules.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I think I read that most of the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force, they had kits. The pilots had kits.
Right.
And they would contain all kinds of stuff, like amphetamine to keep you going, like all kinds of different medication, but one of them was a cyanide tablet in case you were captured.
6 is Heaven's Gate, and we're definitely going to do an episode on this in the future because this is like the real
Heaven's Gate.
UFOs
this is the
and
real,
aliens and shit.
We'll have Ridge back on that one, but Heaven's Gate is definitely like my first introduction to cults, and then kind of went backwards with, as I mentioned at the beginning, reading the article, there was a lot of mentions of Jonestown, so that's what piqued my interest there. But 39 bodies were found with matching attire, and they actually drank poisonous apple juice, but they had like tracksuits that matched. They wore Nikes, so that was kind of a running joke for a while.
Right.
Was like, Nike being tied to cults and that sort of thing. The King of the Hill introduction Ridge mentioned earlier, like that was largely a parody of Heaven's Gate and was about the same time that came out. So that's another big example.
The big thing that Heaven's Gate did was the castrating.
I didn't really know about that.
Yeah, they all.
Yeah.
What did Applewhite?
And then 7, these are my last 2 examples, too. So I've got in 2000, which this is something I wasn't even aware of, in Uganda, there was a movement to restore the 10 Commandments. So this was actually another Christian-related cult. And there's a lot of, because it's in Uganda, it's primitive, yada, yada. There's a lot of speculation as to what actually happened. There's allusions to the fact that they were actually attacked because a lot of the civilization was burnt. But there is also examples of them actually poisoning themselves.
Right.
So this was a movement, and that's one I want to do more research on because that definitely intrigued me when I came across that.
That's interesting, yeah.
And then number 8 was the Addams Family. This was in 2007. This got some popularity because it was they jumped literally under an express train and it like severed their heads off.
Jesus,
that's brutal.
Yeah. And speaking of jumping under express trains, like kind of one of the more fucked up things that happened in the last days of Jonestown, it's been said to or speculated. There's a guy who mysteriously fell, and this is somebody that got in trouble in the community, mysteriously fell asleep on the tracks and died down in Jonestown as well.
Oh, yeah. So he was just taking a nap in a
there's
train
a lot of
smoking.
beliefs that they actually started killing people that fucked up bad enough down there. There's even recordings of them, having the boxing matches and old lady. There's like one of 2 ladies that you can hear just like beating the ever living shit out of each other. It's just so unsettling. And like one of them's like clearly elderly and doesn't have all of her faculties and what have you. Like it's not right.
Yeah.
Quite frankly, it's desensitizing to hear. Mr. Ryan, of course, he did get some notoriety, of course, for his actions and his bravery that he displayed in trying to snuff out the Jonestown people and the nefarious things that were going on there. In 1983, he actually received the Congressional Gold Medal. And in his district in San Mateo, California, in 2009, they actually named a post office after him. So congratulations, you died, you got a post office
You were
after
murdered,
you.
but here's this post office.
So thank you very much for that.
Condolences to your family.
But I mentioned earlier too, kind of a part of all that, of course, like the falling out with Tim Stone was another thing. Like Jim Jones, like really started to like even fuck over his most closest of confidants in many respects, and was ultimately really his demise. Like he even could have got away with everything in Guyana too. Really, it's just like you just quit while you're ahead,
Right. Before it started to really go south, right?
Between that and his drug-fueled nightmares and paranoias, like Jim Jones got so paranoid that he even started to record him preaching. Like he had to be on the sound speakers at the compound constantly, like even after hours overnight. Like he needed to have his voice, his influence permeating people's eardrums constantly. he played old tapes of his preachings and stuff, even whenever he wasn't. But he'd go on like 11, 12-hour jags, like up in his compound talking over the microphone over the entire compound. And, and then again, when he wasn't, the tapes. It's important for us to recognize, too, that the deaths in Jonestown actually didn't stop on the day of the killings in and of itself. There was a lot of people that dealt with the after effects. You have to consider psychologically people going through that sort of trauma, PTSD, lingering depression, anxieties that develop from those sorts of events. Many of the people who survived, I think that and they're not ever included in the death tolls, but those who survived and went stateside and committed suicide themselves because they couldn't live with what was going on or whatever the case was, or succumbed to addictions. A lot of those folks had issues with drugs and alcohol whenever they got out as well, just trying to reach for something to subdue the pain and the horrors that they went through. Those aren't in those totals, in those 900 something totals of people that died on that day. So just kind of to recap the events, and I always like to do this with the who, what, where, when, and why. Who's involved, of course, over 900 Americans, and they identified themselves as the People's Temple. Let's make sure that Peoples were doing that right. There's no apostrophe in there because it insinuates ownership, and with them appealing to African American folks in particular, they did not want to have an ownership type mentality,
like Jim Jones's God Church or something.
And of course, is led by Jim Jones. What happened? The People's Temple's members died after drinking poison at the urging of their leader, Reverend Jim Jones, in the South American jungle settlement. Where we mentioned that, but things started to kick off in Indiana, went out to California, got compound crazy, and franchised his churches down all the way down south until he landed in Guyana eventually. So Guyana, which is near Venezuela in South America, so you get your bearings. When? This is in 1978. It happened on November 18th. This is the largest number of civilian casualties on U.S. citizens until September 11th. So people think of, this happened in Guyana. That's not, yes, it is. They're still U.S. citizens.
Right, they were U.S. citizens, right.
They did not have Guyanese citizenship, so they were U.S. citizens in Guyana who tragically lost their lives. And then why? Of course, we mentioned earlier at the urging of Jim Jones, but due to his drug-induced paranoia and delusions and just his overall God complex and mental health issues that he had himself as a result of all those things. So, kind of the demographics that we talked about earlier of all the people that died there. I mentioned earlier, but Tim Stone, the attorney, his son, actually died there in Jonestown whenever the mass drinking came into play. He was one of 304 people under the age of 17 that died that day on the compound. It's important for us to mention as well, if they didn't die from drinking the poison, they were either shot in the head or they were injected with the poison via syringe. Right. We did kind of mention it in the machinations of events, if you will, but just kind of explicitly so you understand. And again, I can't urge enough that over 300 of the people that died there were children. And obviously it's very sobering to hear. So we're going to play you out with the death tape here today. I'm just going to kind of sign some things off real quickly. And I want to let everybody know that next week we're going to have more positive things to talk about. We're going to bring an old friend onto the show, Nathan Landholt. He's the drummer for Secret Shame. Secret Shame's getting a lot of notoriety. He's in between tours right now, so gracious to give us some of his time. And he's going to be on the show to promote the new record that they got coming out that they just recorded, as well as their upcoming tour. And we're going to incorporate some of their music so you guys kind of see what these audible treats that these cats have to offer for you, and hopefully catch them on a tour date. We are also going to, at the end of the show this week, as we teased at the beginning and been teasing on social media over the last week, we're going to be debuting an exclusive track called Viper Matrix from Pathomite. Pathomite is an amalgamation of genres, so I think that they have a lot to offer for a lot of people. I feel like it could be appealing to people across all platforms. They've got elements of stoner metal, doom metal, progressive rock, post-rock feels at times. They even got like a really cool synth parts in their songs, so these cats can just jam if you're into that.
Good. Yeah, I've got the tape pre-ordered. I'm
very
excited
nice
for that.
Yeah. And Pathomite does have an album release show. It is Friday, April 22nd, the day that this show comes out. Hopefully you already knew about it and went, but perhaps maybe we got you guys at least an extra person to turn out to Red Flag. But it's at Red Flag, April 22nd, this Friday. Doors at 7 p.m., $15 at the door, all ages.
As always, support local music.
100%. And they are releasing their album, Deep Chrome. So Deep Chrome, you can pre-order on tape. Tomorrow, I think they're going to be selling on tape as well. And then they obviously have merch and all those things. You guys check them out. They're on Bandcamp. They're on Apple Music, Spotify. Anywhere you get your audio music, they are everywhere. And Deep Chrome does officially come out in physical release or form, at least the show, on April 22nd. They are available digitally now. They came out this last Tuesday. You can also follow Pathomite to learn more about their shows on Instagram at path_of_might. And then on Facebook, their handle is Take the Path of Might. Ridge, thank you for coming on the show today, sir.
Yeah, Ridge.
Yeah, appreciate
you so
it.
much,
Thank you guys. It's been fun hanging out, talking about Jim Jones and Mr. Muggs.
We'll definitely have to have you back for the next one that we do too.
Yeah, Mr. Muggs actually was shot. We didn't throw that in there.
God damn.
Yeah, Mr. Muggs even got
this
shot.
This is a fucking Disney movie if
I
I've
know.
ever heard of it.
I had to end it on such a shower note, didn't I? It's the most fucked up Disney movie. We had Tarzan's ape friend in the jungle playing with Phil Collins to start things out. It seemed kind of lighthearted, like a lighthearted romp at first. We thought perhaps it would delve into some type of, situational comedy where the boy from the jungle gets with the beautiful girl. But then it turns out that Mr. Muggs got fucking shot.
Got his brain splattered on the cage.
For this week, I am at Barry Insane on Instagram and Twitter.
And I'm Josh on Twitter at BOGW and on Instagram at _Joshua Welch.
And we are out of time. Until next time, guys, good night, good luck. Here's Path of Might with Viper Matrix in the close of the Jonestown Death Tape.
Don't. You'll be sorry. That we do it than that they do it. Us trust you. You have to step across. We used to sing this world's not our home. Well, it sure isn't. As we were saying, it sure wasn't. But he doesn't want to tell him. All he's doing, if they will tell him, assure these children. Some people assure these children of the relaxation of stepping over to the next plane. We've set an example for others. We've set 1,000 people who say we don't like the way the world is. Take our life from us. We laid it down. We got tired. We didn't commit suicide. We committed an act of revolutionary suicide protesting the conditions of an inhumane world.
Hey, this is Josh from ATI Podcast. For show updates and news about the podcast, follow us on social media. You can follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/ATI Podcast 22, on Twitter at podcast_ATI, on Instagram at the ATI Podcast, on TikTok at ATI Podcast. DMs are always welcome. Have a question for the show? You can always email us at atipodcastquestions@gmail.com. Stay safe out there.